Muhammad, the founder of the Islamic religion, came on the scene about 600 years after Jesus and his apostles. He claimed he was the final prophet of the Abrahamic God, and that much of what the Jews and the Christians believed was wrong. He denied the Christian teaching of Jesus being God's divine son, thereby relegating Jesus to the status of a mere man, a mere prophet. Doing this, he also implicitly denied the Christian doctrine of the Trinity. He also denied Jesus' sacrificial death and resurrection for sins. Instead, he put his followers under a set of Islamic laws which he claimed led to salvation if followed. Such ideas resulted in his followers, the Muslims, claiming that the Jewish and Christian scriptures had been corrupted. In this documentary, we will examine whether Muhammad's views are true, and if he was a true prophet of God as Muslims believe. We will also discern if his book, the Quran, is from God. To do this, we will be scrutinizing the earliest Islamic sources on Muhammad's life and teaching. We will be studying the Quran, the Hadith or Sunnah literature containing the sayings and deeds of Muhammad, the early biographies or Sirah literature of Muhammad, and histories of Islam, as well as Islamic scholars and commentators. We will historically consider if Muhammad was correct in his denial of Jesus' deity, death for sins, and resurrection by approaching the ancient Christian sources, using the criteria of authenticity historians use to discern historical truth. Was Muhammad the final messenger of God sent to correct corrupted and false teaching? Or was Muhammad a false prophet sent by Satan to mislead people away from the truth of salvation and Jesus Christ? Join us as we consider these crucial questions exegetically, historically, and rationally. When discerning if Muhammad was a true prophet, it is important to consider his character. According to Muslims in the Quran, Muhammad is a beautiful pattern of conduct and an exalted standard of character. In fact, Muslims claim Muhammad was the final prophet of God for all mankind in all time. In light of this, when we examine the early Muslim sources, we should expect to find a Muhammad who is a moral ambassador of God. However, we actually discover countless abominable immoralities and examples of utter, unnecessary ruthlessness in Muhammad's life.
Muhammad is a man who married more women than his own revelations allowed. He married the wife of his own adopted son.
After Muhammad lusted after his adopted son's wife because of seeing her scantily dressed, his adopted son then divorced her, and Muhammad shortly thereafter married her, claiming this was ordained by God. Surah 33:37 of the Quran mentions this episode, thus showing Muhammad believed his God supported this immorality, quote, "Then when Zayd had dissolved his marriage with her, with the necessary formality, we joined her in marriage to thee," unquote. What a convenient revelation to suit Muhammad's desires. This is adultery according to the Lord Jesus Christ. Matthew 5:32 says, "Everyone who divorces his wife, except on the ground of sexual immorality, makes her commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery," unquote.
But Muhammad, if he is a man for today, let me ask you, why is it he married a girl who was only 6 and then consummated when she was 9 and he was 53 years old? What did he do to the Jews in Medina? Look at what he did. He didn't even come from Medina. He came from Mecca. He moved to Medina in 622. By 624, he started confronting the Jews that were living there, and he threw out the Banu Qainunah family in the first year, 624. A year later, in 625, he threw out the Banu Nadir family. In 627, he took all 800 men of the Banu Qurayza family, gave them spades, had them dig their own trenches, and then slit their throats and let them fall into the trenches. 800 men in one afternoon. Is this a man that's a model for today? Do you really want to follow a man like that? See, I'd rather come back to Jesus Christ. You want a man who's for today, come back to Jesus. He never let us, he didn't let anybody use, he never used violence himself, and even when violence was done against him, the one time that the disciples came to his defense, as he was being arrested there in the Garden of Gethsemane, Peter comes up and cuts off the ear of the servant that's arresting him. What does Jesus do? He takes the ear, puts it back on the servant, turns toward Peter, and says, "Put away your sword. For he who lives by the sword dies by the sword." Matthew 26, verse 52. Ooh, I love my Jesus.
In the law of God, we're told that people are to love the Lord their God with all their heart, mind, soul, and strength, and that we're also to love our neighbor as ourselves. This, Jesus said, for example, is the first and second greatest commandment of the law. Muhammad can be seen to have fundamentally violated this in any number of ways. We even see in the Islamic literature that Muhammad is granted such an authority that he can even make the boast that he stipulated the terms or conditions of a covenant with Allah, and that Allah was not to transgress this. This is a fundamental violation of everything biblical insofar as God is always the one who makes covenants and imposes them on people. People don't have the right to stipulate the terms of a covenant and impose them on God and say that he has to follow them or else. And yet, just to give an example of this in the Hadith literature, we're told in numerous Hadith that Muhammad would often lose his temper, and in the course of this he would end up cursing or even beating someone. And one particular case, we're told Muhammad saw a slave or an orphan girl, and he cursed her. When her caregiver found out about this, she came to Muhammad and asked him what this was all about, and Muhammad smiled at her. And then he said this. He says, "Do you not know that I made a covenant or a condition, a term with Allah, that whoever I curse, if they don't deserve it, then Allah is supposed to make it a source of blessing for that person." So you see what's going on here. It's not simply that Muhammad is saying, don't worry about it, everything's going to be okay. If this person didn't deserve it, that's all right, because Allah is going to bless that person. What actually is going on here is, in the course of covering his tracks for why he would do this sort of pernicious evil, Muhammad actually tells us that he made a covenant. He stipulated conditions or a term that Allah was not to transgress. This is the height of arrogance, and it's an arrogance not simply in vaunting oneself over and against somebody that has greater authority than you, but in this case the God of the universe, the God who made heaven and earth, Muhammad and all creatures, and yet here's one of his creatures pretending to be in a position to dictate things to God. This same story also illustrates the immorality of Muhammad on the horizontal level. The very fact that Muhammad had to bring in this explanation of Allah blessing those Muhammad wrongly curses shows that Muhammad was immoral. He was given to annoyance and fits of rage and outbursts, intemperate outbursts, even against poor orphan girls.
Muhammad claimed the angel Gabriel gave him extreme sexual power, and that people in heaven will have even more. In Ibn Sa'd's early 9th century biography of Muhammad, we read, quote, "The apostle of Allah said, Gabriel brought a kettle from which I ate, and I was given the power of sexual intercourse equal to 40 men. Also, quote, the apostle of Allah was given the power equal to that of 40 men, and the people of paradise will be given the power equal to 80 men, unquote. Things like this show Islam is the product of a depraved 7th century desert man, as opposed to a holy god.
He had sex with his slave girls. He supported idolatrous pagan practices like kissing the black stone and bowing down to the Kaaba. He assassinated people for criticizing his religion. He executed people for making fun of him. He told his followers that women are stupid and that their testimony is unreliable. He tortured people for money. He supported his religion by robbing people. He preached a message of violence and cruelty, and he taught his followers to believe in a God who loves only them and no one else. This is the ideal pattern of conduct, according to chapter 33, verse 21 of the Quran.
According to Quran 4:34, Muhammad allowed Muslim men to beat their wives, quote, "But those wives from whom you fear arrogance, first advise them, then if they persist, forsake them in bed, and finally strike them." However, Muslim apologist Mustafa Zaid claims the original Arabic word merely means beat them lightly. This is false. The original Arabic word is wadrabahuna, and according to John Penrose, its primary meaning is simply, quote, to beat, strike, unquote. Moreover, the following scholarly Quran translations of this verse say beat, scourge, or strike, as opposed to beat lightly. Also, the following Quranic commentators translate the word as beat, as opposed to beat lightly. Quranic scholar and commentator Allama Usmani says this verse means a man can beat his wife as hard as he wants, as long as he doesn't break her bones or cause a scar. Now, in Sahih Bukhari, we read about a Muslim man beating his wife, quote, "When Allah's messenger came, Aisha said, I have not seen any woman suffering as much as the believing women. Look, her skin is greener than her clothes." According to this hadith, Muhammad did not chastise the man at all for beating his wife. Instead, he sided with the husband concerning their dispute. Also, in the following hadith, Muhammad's wife Aisha recalls an event concerning Muhammad and her, quote, "Muhammad struck me on the chest, which caused me pain," unquote. In fact, Abu Bakr seems to have learned similar behavior from Muhammad. For, in Sahih Bukhari, we read, narrated Aisha, "Abu Bakr came towards me and struck me violently with his fist and said, 'You have detained the people because of your necklace.' But I remained motionless as if I was dead, lest I should awake Allah's apostle, although that hit was very painful." What is more, in one hadith, Muhammad found it hilarious when his father-in-laws Abu Bakr and Umar slapped and abused various women, including his, that is Muhammad's, own wives. Quote, he, Hadrat Umar, said, I would say something which would make the Prophet laugh, so he said, Messenger of Allah, I wish you had seen the treatment meted out to the daughter of Khadija when she asked me some money, and I got up and slapped her on the neck. Allah's apostle laughed and said, they around me, as you see, asking for extra money. Abu Bakr then got up and went to Aisha and slapped her on the neck, and Umar stood before Hafsa and slapped her, saying, you ask Allah's messenger which he does not possess. They said, by Allah, we do not ask Allah's messenger for anything he does not possess. Muhammad also said, a man will not be asked as to why he beat his wife. This saying is also attested in the following source. Lastly, in his tafsir, the 12th century Islamic scholar al-Zamakhshari notes Muhammad as saying, hang the whip so your wives can see it.
There's so much about Sharia law that just is not relevant for today. And if you have any doubt, just take a look at ISIS. ISIS is probably the best example of Sharia law today, because what ISIS is doing, what Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the man who is leading ISIS, the leader of ISIS, he is going right back to the Quran, right back to the traditions, applying Sharia law as the Prophet, his Prophet, did it. And it comes straight out of this book. And that's why it is so barbaric. That's why they are cutting off the heads of the prisoners. And that's right in Surah 47, Ayah 4. That's why they're crucifying. That's in Surah 4. That's why they're beating the wives. That's in Surah 4, Ayah 34. That's why they're cutting off the hands of thieves. That's in Surah 5, Ayah 38. And I could go on and on and on and on. It is barbaric. It is not relevant for today. It doesn't work. It eradicates my freedoms. That's why I don't want Sharia law today. It just doesn't make sense. Bring me back to that which Jesus gave in his example. That does make sense. And I say this all the time. Keith, I tell people, can you show me one thing that's irrelevant with Jesus Christ? And I've said that for 33 years. I've asked that question. In 33 years, I've yet to find anybody that can find anything wrong with Jesus. So if you want the best law, the best example, the best model, the best paradigm, come on back to Jesus. We've got him. Come on home.
Muhammad allowed his followers to do mutta. When Muhammad's soldiers were in battle and away from their wives and became desirous and impassioned, they sought Muhammad's advice. Muhammad's allegedly inspired solution from God was that they should engage in mutta marriage. Mutta marriage is a temporary marriage contract with a woman for the purpose of sex that would be quickly annulled after the man's sexual desires were taken care of. Bukhari reports, narrated Abdullah, we used to participate in the holy battles led by Allah's apostle, and we had nothing, no wives with us. So we said, shall we get ourselves castrated? He forbade us that, and then allowed us to marry women with a temporary contract, and recited to us, O you who believe, make not unlawful the good things which Allah has made lawful for you, but commit no transgression. Quran 587, unquote. Muhammad allowed the rape of female war captives while their husbands were alive and present. This is taught in Quran 4:24, quote, also prohibited are women already married, except those whom your right hands possess, unquote. The historical background about the giving of this verse is found in the following hadith. Abu Sayyid al-Khudri said, the Apostle of Allah sent a military expedition to Autas on the occasion of the Battle of Hunain. They met their enemy and fought with them. They defeated them and took them captives. Some of the companions of the Apostle of Allah were reluctant to have intercourse with the female captives in the presence of their husbands, who were unbelievers. So Allah, the Exalted, sent down the Quranic verse, and all married women are forbidden unto you, save those captives whom your right hands possess. That is to say, they are lawful for them when they complete their waiting period. This is clearly rape, since the Muslim is allowed to have sex with a captive woman while her husband is still alive and present. No sane woman would want to have sex with a warrior who just killed her tribesmen and while her husband was still present. Thus, such sex can be said to be rape. The true God hates rape and would never permit this. Deuteronomy 22:25 says, but if in the open country a man meets a young woman who is betrothed, and the man seizes her and lies with her, then only the man who lay with her shall die, unquote. Muhammad sucked the tongues of the sons of his companions, which is immoral and perverted. Quote, Muawiyah said, I saw the Prophet sucking on the tongue or the lips of Al-Hasan, son of Ali. For no tongue or lips that the Prophet sucked will be tormented by hellfire. Also in a Bukhari hadith we read, then he, Muhammad, said, where is the little one? Call the little one to me. Hassan came running and jumped into his lap. Then he put his hand on his beard. Then the Prophet opened his mouth and put his tongue in his mouth. Then he said, O Allah, I love him, so love him and the one who loves him, unquote. Now, to save face, some Muslims read into the text the idea that this had to do with dehydration, but there is no evidence of this in the text. And if the boy was dehydrated, why was he running around excited, jumping in Muhammad's lap? Muhammad enjoyed making old women cry for fun. In Ibn Kathir's Life of the Prophet Muhammad, an old woman asked Muhammad to pray she would make it to paradise. Instead, he told her there would be no old women in paradise. She walked away crying. Later, as he laughed, he told one of his companions to go tell her what he meant was she would not be old in paradise, but turned into a virgin. Thus, Muhammad enjoyed seeing old women cry in fear of not making it to heaven. Muhammad lured converts with promises of women with swelling breasts in heaven. Quran 78:31-33 says, "Verily for the pious is a blissful place, gardens and vineyards, and girls with swelling breasts of the same age as themselves." Unquote. Rather than a description of a holy paradise with Almighty God, this sounds more like some sort of celestial brothel imagined up by a depraved 7th century desert nomad. Moreover, Muhammad invented more convenient revelations along with the one we already mentioned, involving him marrying his adopted son's wife. For example, at first Muhammad would give his wives equal attention on separate nights, but then afterwards he began to favor certain wives, and Quran 33:51 was then conveniently revealed to him, which says, "Thou mayest defer the turn of any of them that thou pleasest, and thou mayest receive any thou pleasest, and there is no blame on thee if thou invite one of those turn thou hadst set aside." Unquote. Muhammad's wife Aisha, keen on what was taking place, then said the following in response, quote, "I feel that your Lord hastens in fulfilling your wishes and desires." Unquote. Moreover, one night it was Hafsa's turn to be with Muhammad, but she had to go somewhere. Muhammad therefore decided to instead have intimate relations with one of his slave girls he was not married to in Hafsa's bed, namely Mary the Copt. Hafsa found out and she was very upset. In response, Muhammad claimed Quran 66:1 was revealed to him in order to justify his behavior. It says, quote, "O Prophet, why do you ban for yourself that which Allah has made lawful to you, seeking to please your wives?" Then Muhammad claimed Quran 66:3-5 was revealed to him, which was a stern rebuke of Aisha and Hafsa for being upset with Muhammad for his actions with Mary the Copt. These are but a few of Muhammad's convenient revelations. How do they square up with Muhammad's other claim that the Quran is eternal and meant for all peoples and times, if much of it was meant to merely serve Muhammad's desires? Not only was Muhammad incredibly immoral, but so were his companions and his first successors of the Islamic State, that is, the caliphs. If Jesus' disciples acted the way Muhammad's companions acted, Christians would never hear the end of it. The fact is, Muhammad's cousin and close companion Ibn Abbas, who was praised by Muslims as one of Islam's greatest commentators of the Quran, was actually a very wicked man. When Caliph Ali appointed him as governor of Basra, Iraq, Ibn Abbas betrayed Ali and stole a large amount of money and provisions from the Muslim treasury for himself and left to go live in Mecca. Now, Muhammad's early followers also murdered each other in order to gain leadership over the Muslim people after Muhammad died. For example, after Muhammad's death, Uthman, the third caliph, was assassinated by Egyptian Muslims and Abu Bakr's son, who supported Ali as the rightful caliph. Tabari reports, Muhammad b. Abi Bakr, Abu Bakr's son, came with 13 Egyptian men and went up to Uthman. He seized his beard and shook it until I heard his teeth chattering. Muhammad b. Abi Bakr said, "Muawiyah was no help to you, nor was Ibn Amir, nor your letters." Uthman said, "Let go of my beard, son of my brother, let go of my beard." Then I saw Ibn Abi Bakr signaling with his eye to one of the rebels. He came over to him with a broad iron-headed arrow and stabbed him in the head with it. They gathered round him and killed him. Unquote. Then Ali became the fourth caliph. Now Muhammad's wife Aisha hated Ali for years because he accused her of being unfaithful to Muhammad, and thus she incited Muslims to fight against him. At the same time, Talha and Al-Zubair, companions of Muhammad, wanted Ali dead and did not recognize his succession as caliph. This resulted in the Battle of the Camel, where Aisha, Talha, Al-Zubair, and thousands of Muhammad's followers, family and friends fought Caliph Ali and the Muslims under his leadership. Thousands of Muslims died in the battle, but Ali was eventually victorious. Talha and Zubair were killed, while Aisha was arrested. Next, a relative of Muhammad and writer of the Quran who was close to Uthman named Muawiyah accused Ali, the fourth caliph, of harboring the murderers of Uthman, the third caliph. This led to the Battle of Siffin between Ali and Muawiyah, where many Muslims died fighting each other. Then later a Muslim assassinated Ali, and Muawiyah proclaimed himself caliph. It is because of events like this that the Sunni versus Shiite split occurred, leading to mutual hatred and fighting between them Even to this day, the Shiites support Ali and side with him against Muhammad's other companions who fought him, while the Sunnis hate the Shiites for doing so.
One of the biggest problems for Muslims is the spiritual reliability of Muhammad. Some of the descriptions of Muhammad receiving revelation sound like something straight out of The Exorcist. Apart from that, there are a number of details in the Muslim sources that seriously call into question Muhammad's spiritual reliability.
When Muhammad was young, his foster mother thought he was demon-possessed, since two beings threw him to the ground and he was found with a livid face. Moreover, Muhammad's first alleged revelational experience with the being that would come to be viewed as Gabriel was actually demonic. In Sahih Bukhari, we read about this early encounter in the cave of Hira between Muhammad and this being, quote, "The Prophet added, 'The angel caught me forcefully and pressed me so hard that I could not bear it any more. Then he released me and again asked me to read, and I replied, I do not know how to read. Thereupon he caught me again and pressed me a second time till I could not bear it any more. Then he released me again and asked me to read, but again I replied, I do not know how to read, or what shall I read? Thereupon he caught me for the third time and pressed me, and then released me and said, Read in the name of your Lord, who has created all that exists, has created man from a clot, read, and your Lord is the most generous.'" Another early report says here Muhammad was being strangled so hard he felt like he was going to die.
We know from Muslim records that when Muhammad began receiving revelations, his first impression was that he was demon-possessed. We know that after his experience in the cave, he became suicidal, tried to hurl himself off a cliff. We know that it was his wife Khadija and her cousin Waraka who persuaded him that he wasn't possessed, he was a prophet of God. Now, what happened to Muhammad in the cave when the Quran started coming to him? I don't know. But I know this, when he ran out of that cave, terrified, depressed, and suicidal, he was convinced that he had seen a demon, and that's a problem.
Initially, Muhammad's wife's cousin Waraka correctly believed Muhammad was demon-possessed. After Muhammad's wife Khadija explained to Waraka what was happening with Muhammad after his first encounter with the being who would come to be seen as Gabriel, Waraka had a very interesting perspective, quote, Waraka expressed surprise and said Jibreel only came to prophets, the best of creatures, so he wished to meet the prophet. He said that sometimes the devil deceives people pretending to be Jibreel, and then he to whom the devil goes turns mad, unquote. This is correct, as 2 Corinthians 11:14 says, and no wonder, for even Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. Muhammad's revelations were clearly demonic possessions. During his alleged revelations, Muhammad would hear ringing in his ears and sweat profusely. He would turn red and breathe heavily. He would be choked. He would move his lips quickly. He would hear voices thinking trees and rocks were speaking to him. He would fall to his knees with trembling shoulders. He would feel dread and terror. He would have a racing heart with swollen veins on his shoulders and neck. He would have a severe fever. This is consistent with demonic possession, and it's inconsistent with what is documented about the experiences of previous prophets who received actual revelations from God.
And there are other problems. Think about the satanic verses, the verses that Muhammad delivered to his followers and later claimed were from Satan. When Muhammad, this is how the story goes, when Muhammad was preaching in Mecca, he didn't win very many converts, but he wanted his countrymen to accept Islam, and he was hoping to receive a revelation that would help them. And then one day, of course, he got the revelation he was looking for. It said, "Have you not heard of Alat and Alusa and Manat, the third, the other? These are the exalted cranes whose intercession is to be hoped for." So there are these three goddesses that are like birds. They're exalted cranes who can carry your prayers to Allah. This was originally part of Surah 53 of the Quran. Muhammad delivered these verses to his followers. He bowed down in honor of them, and his followers bowed down with him. But a little while later, Muhammad told his followers that these verses, which he had delivered as part of the Quran, weren't really from God, they were from Satan. And he replaced them with the words that we find in the Quran today. So when you read Surah 53, keep in mind the fact that it originally promoted polytheism and that Muhammad couldn't tell the difference between a revelation from God and a revelation from Satan. It's also interesting to note that at one point late in life, Muhammad was a victim of a magic spell, according to him, not according to me. Several passages in Bukhari report that someone stole a hairbrush from Muhammad and used it to cast a spell on him. Ibn Ishaq tells us that Muhammad was bewitched during this time, and Bukhari adds that the spell made him delusional. So according to Muslim sources, God's greatest prophet was under a spell for, let's say, a year, and that's a problem.
In Quran 69:44-46, Muhammad stated if he fabricated false teachings, i.e. invented revelations not from God, then he would have his aorta cut, it says. And if he had fabricated against us some of the sayings, we would certainly have seized him by the right hand, then we would certainly have cut off his aorta. Well, it just so happens that the Muslim sources tell us Muhammad was poisoned by a Jewish person, and then reported that it caused him to feel as if his aorta was being cut. Quote, narrated Aisha, the Prophet in his ailment in which he died used to say, "O Aisha, I still feel the pain caused by the food I ate at Kabar, and at this time I feel as if my aorta is being cut from that poison."
And so we look at the historical records, and we find that Muhammad originally thought he was demon-possessed. He became suicidal when he started receiving his revelations. He delivered verses from Satan, and people could cast spells on it. And a lot of Muslims don't know anything about this, but even if you point it out, they say, it's no big deal. But I look at it and say, maybe there's something wrong here.
According to Islam, the Quran is infallible, that is, it is free from error. Moreover, Islam teaches Muhammad's sunnah, that is, his sayings and deeds in the hadith literature, are to be followed by Muslims. This presupposes they are accurate and thus worthy to be followed. For example, Muhammad said, "Keep to my sunnah." And there are many references in the Quran ordering Muslims to obey and emulate Muhammad's teaching and example. Thus, if there are historical, scientific, logical, and prophetic errors in the Quran and authentic hadith material, this proves Muhammad was a false prophet, and that Islam is false.
The Quran is chock full of errors, whether logical or historical, scientific, mathematical. You name the category, the Quran probably has an error that would fit into it. An example of a logical contradiction appears when you compare, for example, a handful of verses in the Quran, such as Surah 2, verse 221, where we are told that Muslims cannot marry idolaters and unbelievers. If we compare that to Surah 5:5, where we're told that Muslim men can marry Christian women, we may infer from that Christian women are not idolaters and unbelievers. That is, if Muslims cannot marry idolaters and they can marry Christians, then Christians, as a matter of deductive certainty, can't be idolaters. However, according to Surah 9, verses 28 through 33, Christians are idolaters and unbelievers, so the Quran contradicts itself.
Muhammad taught Alexander the Great was a righteous Muslim who believed in and obeyed Allah. In Surah 18 of the Quran, Dhul Qarnayn, which means two horns, is said to be a man who had Allah's support, was holy and righteous, and believed in and worked with and obeyed Allah. There is much evidence the author of the Quran viewed this Dhul Qarnayn as Alexander the Great. First, many of Islam's greatest commentators of the Quran affirm these verses are about Alexander the Great. Second, on ancient coins there are drawings of Alexander the Great with two horns on his head, which is significant since, again, Dhul Qarnayn means two horns. Third, Arabs like Al-Asha, who was a poet living shortly prior to Muhammad, and Hassan ibn Thabit, who was contemporary with Muhammad, called Alexander the Great Dhul Qarnayn. Thus, the expert on Alexander the Great, Richard Stoneman, affirms, quote, "The two names, Alexander the Great and Dhul Qarnayn, were already synonymous when Muhammad came to compose this surah of the Quran. In fact, modern scholars have shown the Quranic story of this Dhul Qarnayn in Surah 18 actually comes from the pre-Islamic mythical Syriac source called A Christian Legend Concerning Alexander, translated into English by Sir Ernest Alfred Wallace Budge in 1889. When one compares the Quranic story in Surah 18 to the Syriac tale of Alexander the Great side by side, there is no question this is where the Quran got the Alexander fable. There are more than 11 similar features between the two stories, such as Alexander having two horns, being given power, the sun rising on the people with no cover, punishment of the unrighteous, Gog and Magog spoiling the land, and the building of a wall as a defense. As Stoneman notes, quote, "The commentators on the Quran universally assumed that Dhul Qarnayn here in Surah 18 is the name of Alexander. Their assumption was clearly correct, since the two stories here in Surah 18 associated with Dhul Qarnayn are precisely those two stories associated with Alexander in the Syriac legend of Alexander, current shortly before the composition of the Quran. This proves unequivocally the Quran is not of divine origin, but instead stole earlier uninspired mythical stories or legends. Moreover, Surah 18 also proves the Quran is historically inaccurate for claiming Alexander the Great was a righteous man who believed in and obeyed Allah. For the historical evidence concerning Alexander the Great shows he was actually an unrighteous polytheistic pagan. The two earliest extant and most reliable biographies of Alexander the Great were written by Arrian and Plutarch. According to Arrian, quote, "Alexander offered sacrifice on the following day to the gods who had revealed the signs and assured him," unquote. Similarly, Plutarch relayed, quote, The empire of the Persians was thought to be utterly dissolved, and Alexander, proclaimed king of Asia, made magnificent sacrifices to the gods, unquote. Arrian also reported, quote, I pity Alexander for his mishap, because on that occasion he showed himself the slave of two vices, anger and drunkenness, unquote. Finally, Plutarch relayed Alexander engaged in drunken homosexual acts, quote, he, Alexander, was once viewing some contests in singing and dancing, being well heated with wine, and that his favorite, Bagoas, won the prize for song and dance, and then, all in his festal array, passed through the theater and took his seat by Alexander's side, at sight of which the Macedonians clapped their hands and loudly bade the king kiss the victor, until at last he threw his arms about him and kissed him tenderly, unquote.
An example of a scientific error in the Quran can be found in Surah 596. According to that passage, Muslims can eat anything that swims in the seas or the oceans, the waters, and this is in contrast to other foods that Allah has forbidden. However, if this verse is true, then it would be okay, there'd be no problem in eating things like stonefish, pufferfish or blowfish, a triggerfish, poison dart frog, barracuda, a marble cone snail. All of these things are poisonous for human beings, and yet Allah says, eat up. That's a very clear scientific error.
The Quran claims mountains were placed down onto earth as pegs. Quran 31:10 says, quote, he has created the heavens without any pillars that you can see, and he has placed in the earth firm mountains that it may not quake with you, unquote. Quran 78:6-7 also says, have we not made the earth as a bed and the mountains as pegs, unquote. Daryabadi translates the last Arabic word as stakes. These texts teach the way mountains appeared was that God placed them down onto earth from the sky, like pegs or stakes. The scientific problem is mountains are actually formed by tectonic plates colliding together. As we read in the science book, Physical Geography, quote, the world's highest mountains, the Himalayas, were formed when the Indian plate collided with the Eurasia. The Alps were formed in a similar manner in a collision between the African and Eurasian plates, unquote. Muhammad taught the traits of children are determined by which parent climaxes first during sexual intercourse. Muhammad said, quote, as for the resemblance of the child to its parents, if a man has sexual intercourse with his wife and gets discharged first, the child will resemble the father, and if the woman gets discharged first, the child will resemble her, unquote. This is a serious scientific error, proving Muhammad was a false prophet. A child's traits are determined by genes inherited by the mother and the father, and it has nothing to do with who climaxes first during sexual intercourse. As one modern science textbook on heredity points out, quote, every person has 2 copies of most genes in their genome. One copy of the gene comes from their mother, and the other one comes from their father. The 2 copies of the genes are not exactly the same. They contain small changes in the sequence of DNA bases. These 2 different versions of the same gene are called alleles. The small differences in the alleles cause offspring to resemble their parents without looking exactly the same as either parent.
An example of a mathematical error in the Quran arises from Surah 4, verses 11 through 12, where we're given the inheritance law in Islam. And so if you read that passage, the way it works out is, for example, if a person left a wife, 2 daughters, a father and a mother behind, then the wife would get 1/8 of the inheritance, the daughters would get 2/3, the father would get 1/6, and the mother would get 1/6. And if you do the math, it comes out to, I think it's 27/24, which of course doesn't jive. That is, they're due to inherit more than the person actually has.
The Quran falsely teaches the New Testament Virgin Mary was the sister of the Old Testament figure Aaron, and that she was the daughter of Imran, who was Aaron's father. The reason the Quran made this serious mistake was because Aaron's sister was also called Mary, just like Jesus' mother was, and Muhammad therefore confused the two. This historical error shows the Quran is not inspired by God. Muslims offer different unconvincing responses to this, but the Muslim scholar Muhammad Assad claims the Quran only referred to Mary's ancestral relationship to Aaron when it called her the sister of Aaron. However, this response won't work because Quran 3:35-38 explicitly says, the wife of Imran, i.e. Aaron's mother, literally gave birth to Mary, the mother of Jesus. In Quran 1886, which, as we noted, concerns Alexander the Great, we read, quote, until when he reached the setting of the sun, he found it set in a spring of murky water. Near it he found a people, unquote. This is clearly a scientific error since the sun does not and is not small enough to set in a spring of water. In response, Islamic commentator Maulana Daryabadi argues the Arabic word for found here Wajada should be taken in a subjective sense, meaning he perceived it setting in water, even though Daryabadi admits the word can have an objective meaning corresponding to fact, i.e. he found it setting in water. However, Daryabadi is mistaken because right after this verse says Alexander found the sun setting in water, it then continues and says he also found a people, using the same Arabic word for found, wajada. Thus, according to the Quran, the same way Alexander literally found a people, he literally found the sun setting in water. And lastly, in a sound hadith in Sunan Abu Dawud, Muhammad said the sun literally sets in water, not that it's only perceived to do such. Quote, narrated Abu Dar, I was sitting behind the Messenger of Allah who was riding a donkey while the sun was setting. He asked, do you know where the sun sets? I replied, Allah and his apostle know best. He said, it sets in a spring of warm water, unquote. The Quran is full of other logical errors or contradictions. For example, did creation take Allah 8 days as Quran 41:9-12 clearly shows, or 6 days as Quran 25:59 clearly says? Is it possible for Muslims to treat their 4 wives justly, tadilu, as Quran 4:3 indicates, or is it not possible to treat them justly, tadilu, as Quran 4:129 indicates? It depends on what verse you read. Will the food for people in hell be from a tree with fruit stalks like the heads of devils as Quran 37:62-66 says? Or will it only be foul pus as Quran 69:36 says? Or will it only be bitter dari as Quran 88:6 says? Will there be no questioning and inquiry of earthly acquaintances on that day, i.e. the day of judgment, as Quran 23:99-101 clearly says? Or will such questioning and inquiry indeed take place on that day, as Quran 37:26-28 clearly says? Did Allah create the earth first and then the heavens second, as Quran 2:29 says? Or did he create the heavens first and then the earth second, as Quran 79:27-32 says? Because Muhammad was a false prophet, he made many false prophecies. Deuteronomy 18:22 says, when a prophet speaks in the name of the Lord, if the word does not come to pass, or come true, that is a word that the Lord has not spoken. The prophet has spoken it presumptuously. You need not be afraid of him, unquote. In Quran 32-4, Muhammad taught the Byzantines would defeat the Persians within 3 to 9 years, after the Persians first defeated them. It says, the Byzantines have been defeated in the nearest land, but they, after their defeat, will overcome, within 3 to 9 years, unquote. That the Arabic phrase, fi biddi sina, does indeed refer to 3 to 9 years, is evidenced by many sources. As quoted, the Sahih International translation of the Quran renders the phrase as 3 to 9 years, as do the Mushin Khan and Pickthall translations. Moreover, Abdul Manan Omar's Dictionary of the Holy Quran affirms the word means, quote, few, range between 3 and 9. Also, the Islamic scholar Allama Usmani confirms, in lexicon and in the tradition, the word biddi is applied to a period ranging from 3 to 9 years, unquote. Moreover, Yusuf Ali also confirms, quote, bid in the text means a short period, a period from 3 to 9 years, unquote. So there's no question. However, the first battle Muhammad talked about was in AD 614, when the Persians shockingly conquered Jerusalem and defeated the Byzantines, who were led by Emperor Heraclius. Then the Byzantines did defeat the Persians afterwards, but it was 13 years later in AD 627 at Nineveh, not 3 to 9 years later, as Muhammad falsely prophesied. This is a major false prophecy proving Muhammad was a false prophet. Next, in Quran 3:150-151, Muhammad predicted the Muslims would be victorious in the Battle of Uhud, with the Meccan pagans, quote, nay, God is your protector, and he is the best of helpers. Soon shall we cast terror into the hearts of the unbelievers, for that they joined companions with God, for which he had sent no authority. Their abode will be the fire, and evil is the home of the wrongdoers, unquote. So according to Muhammad, God would protect the Muslims in this battle, terror would be cast into the hearts of the opposing army, and the abode of the opposing army would be hell. This indicates the Muslims would win the battle. Indeed, the commentator Ibn Abbas explained this was a prophecy of triumph regarding the Battle of Uhud. However, the Muslims went on to lose this battle in a devastating fashion, as Muslim scholar Ibn Kathir affirmed, quote, as Sudi said, when the disbelievers attacked Muslim lines during the Battle of Uhud and defeated them, some Muslims ran away to El-Medina, unquote. This is a major false prophecy. Now, in Sahih Muslim, Muhammad falsely predicted the last hour would happen during the lifetime of a young boy who was present with him, quote, Anas reported a person asked Allah's messenger as to when the last hour would come. He had in his presence a young boy of the Ansar who was called Muhammad. Allah's messenger said, if this young boy lives, he may not grow very old till he would see the last hour coming to you, unquote. Moreover, Muhammad predicted the end of the world would happen very shortly after his life, quote, Anas reported Allah's messenger as saying, I and the last hour have been sent like this, and while doing it, joined the forefinger and the middle finger. Muhammad said this about 1400 years ago, which is clearly incorrect. Also, Muhammad predicted, quote, the last hour would come when the Romans would form a majority amongst people, unquote. However, the largest people group in the world is by far the Han Chinese, who have over a 1.2 billion person population. Thus, Muhammad was wrong, since the Han Chinese far supersede any ethnic group, including Romans, in terms of population number and growth. Because Muhammad was demon-possessed and also under the control of black magic, he went mad and produced some of the most crazy and irrational teachings ever known. Muhammad taught spitting to the left stops bad dreams. In Sahih Bukhari we read, narrated Abu Karta, the Prophet said, a good dream that comes true is from Allah, and a bad dream is from Satan. So if any one of you sees a bad dream, he should seek refuge with Allah from Satan, and should spit on the left, for the bad dream will not harm him, unquote. This is strange and superstitious.
Muhammad taught quite a number of absurd things that no modern person could possibly hold to. For example, he taught that Adam was created 90 feet tall. We have no evidence for that, and although Muhammad doesn't say, I suppose it follows that Eve was also created 90 feet tall, otherwise that would have made for a very awkward relationship, to say the least. But so apparently, according to Muhammad, since the time of Adam and Eve, people have been decreasing in stature, so that we've been getting shorter and shorter. Even if it were the case that people have been getting shorter, it hasn't been from an original starting point of 90 feet, but something substantially lower than that.
Muhammad commanded a grown woman to breastfeed a younger man she was not married to. In Sahih Muslim we read, Salha, daughter of Suhail, came to Allah's messenger and said, Allah's messenger, I swear by Allah, that I see in the face of Abu Hudayfa the signs of disgust on account of entering of Salim in the house. Whereupon Allah's messenger said, suckle him. She said, he has a beard. But he again said, suckle him, and it would remove what is there, expression of disgust, on the face of Abu Hudayfa. This is twisted. Moreover, Muhammad taught some adult breastfeeding is okay. In fact, Muhammad's wife Aisha claimed verses discussing this in the Quran got lost, thereby corrupting the Quran. Quote, Aisha reported that it had been revealed in the Holy Quran that 10 clear sucklings make the marriage unlawful. Then it was abrogated and substituted by 5 sucklings, and Allah's apostle died, and it was before that time found in the Holy Quran and recited by the Muslims, unquote.
Muhammad taught that unbelievers eat in 7 intestines, whereas believers, which he meant Muslims by, eat in 2 intestines. He's taught that people are not to sleep on their left side or on their stomach, because Satan sleeps on his left side and stomach. He also taught that you're not supposed to eat with your left hand or drink with your left hand, because Satan eats and drinks with his left hand.
Muhammad commanded people to drink camel urine. In Sahih Muslim we read, Anas b. Malik reported that some people of the tribe of Ukul, or Urena, came to Allah's messenger and they found the climate of Medina uncongenial. Allah's messenger commanded them to milk she-camels and commanded them to drink their urine and their milk, unquote. We see a similar command in Sahih Bukhari to drink camel urine as medicine. However, according to the Australian Department of Health, quote, the World Health Organization advises that people should avoid drinking raw camel milk or camel urine, unquote. Now, in the Quran, it is said Muhammad was the seal of the prophets. This means Muslims believe he was the final prophet. Muslims are very proud the Quran says Muhammad was the seal of the prophets.
All the prophets have, which Allah wanted to send, have all been sent, and now the Prophet ﷺ, as though he was the last, and he's put a seal on this whole line of prophethood.
That is the significance of the seal. But the identity of the seal is where things get quite bizarre. In Sahih Muslim, we're told Muhammad's seal of prophethood was a bunch of hairy moles between his shoulders, quote. Abdullah b. Sarjis reported, I then went after him and saw the seal of prophethood between his shoulders, on the left side of his shoulder having spots on it like moles. This was supposed to be the proof of Muhammad's prophethood. As Muslim writer Muhammad Sayyid Abdul Rahman said, quote, between his shoulders was the seal of prophethood, which was a sign of his truthfulness, and that he was indeed the promised prophet, unquote. Yet the biblical prophets did not have moles proving they were prophets. There is no pre-Islamic prophecy claiming a future prophet will have moles. This is a bizarre Islamic innovation and a very inadequate proof of prophethood.
Muhammad taught that people who listen to music run the risk of being crushed by Allah with a mountain. Allah could make a mountain crush over them, or he may turn them into apes and pigs. This, of course, is Darwinism in reverse. He taught that you're to inhale water up your nose and blow it out after you've slept, when you wake up from a nap or from sleeping overnight, because Satan lodges in your nose. No doubt he's sleeping on his left side or on his stomach up there, but in order to get Satan out of there, you're supposed to exhale water violently from your nose.
Although embarrassed Muslims interpret this in different metaphorical ways to defend Muhammad, it should be noted the distinguished Muslim scholar Muhammad Khan explains this hadith saying, quote, "We should believe that Satan actually stays in the upper part of one's nose, though we cannot perceive how." In another hadith in Sahih Bukhari we read, quote, narrated Abdullah, "It was mentioned before the Prophet that there was a man who slept the night till morning after sunrise. The Prophet said, 'He is a man in whose ears or ear Satan had urinated,'" unquote. Muhammad taught men in heaven will have eternal erections. In Sunan Ibn Majah we read, quote, Abu Umama narrated, "The Messenger of God said, everyone that God admits into paradise will be married to 72 wives. 2 of them are virgins, and 70 of his inheritance of the dwellers of hell. All of them will have a pleasant vagina, and he will have a sexual organ that does not bend down." This shows Islam is not from a holy God. In a radio debate, Muslim apologist Jalal Abul Arab limited the Islamic concept of jihad to personal struggle.
Jihad means to struggle. It doesn't mean to fight.
Moreover, a popular pro-Islamic website similarly claimed jihad, quote, "has nothing whatsoever to do with holy war. There is nothing holy about wars." This is a common tactic by Muslim apologists in the West. The Islamic propaganda organization, the Council on American Islamic Relations, or CAIR, even engaged in an ad campaign where they put up banners on buses with slogans such as, "My jihad is to stay fit," in order to convey the idea jihad has nothing to do with holy war. However, there is much authoritative and scholarly Islamic material proving jihad can also refer to holy war. Abdul Manan Omar's Dictionary of the Holy Quran notes one of the meanings of jihad is fighting or holy war. Penros's A Dictionary and Glossary of the Quran confirms jihad can mean, quote, "a going forth to fight in the holy war," unquote. Moreover, in Sahih Bukhari, the most authentic hadith collection, jihad is explicitly defined as religious fighting, holy battles, holy fighting, one who strives to be martyred, and fighting in Allah's cause. Moreover, one of Islam's most respected scholars, Ibn Kathir, stated bluntly in his commentary on the Quran, quote, "Jihad involves killing and shedding the blood of men," unquote. Now, Muslim apologists in the West often quote peaceful Quranic verses Muhammad produced in Mecca when he was weak and didn't have an army, or when in Medina prior to implementing offensive jihad. However, the Quran clearly teaches the principle of abrogation, meaning previous revelation sometimes gets cancelled out for later revelation.
Now, what you need to do is you need to go to the first part of the Quran, which is the Medina material, because that is the most authoritative part of the Quran, primarily because that's the latter part of the revelation that was revealed to the Prophet Muhammad, their Prophet Muhammad, between 622 and 632, the last 10 years of his life, when he was in Medina. That's why it's called the Medinan surahs. And in those surahs, you will find verse after verse after verse after verse that talks about jihad. Slay the unbeliever wherever ye find them. Besiege them. Lay in wait for them with every kind of ambush. That's Surah 9, Ayah 5. Make war on the unbeliever. Slay the unbeliever until there is no more fitna in the land. That's Surah 8, Ayah 39. Cut off the heads of the unbeliever. Surah 47, verse 4. And it goes on and on and on and on. There are so many verses. There's about 150 verses in the Quran that are violent. When you have any contradictions in the Quran, you have what they call law of abrogation. Surah 2, Ayah 106, and Surah 16, Ayah 101, which stipulates if you have a first verse, that's mansuk, and you have another verse that comes after, that's nasik. Nasik is strong, mansuk is weak. A nasik verse always abrogates a weak verse. So if they contradict each other, you always go with the later verse, which would be, of course, the Medinan verses. And these are all Medinan. And the last, the last surah to be revealed to Muhammad was Surah 9. So it abrogates anything that comes before. So anything that comes and stands against it, it takes precedence. Surah 9, do not read before you go to bed. It is probably the most violent chapter. It is the most violent chapter in the Quran. It is full of verse after verse after verse, like Surah 9:5 and Surah 9, Ayah 29.
Thus, when Muslims quote Surah 109:6, for example, when Muhammad said to the pagans, "To you your religion and to me mine," in order to try to prove Islam is peaceful, It must be noted this was abrogated by Muhammad's later violent teachings, in verses he gave after his migration to Medina when he got powerful. As the influential Islamic commentary Tafsir al-Jalalain says concerning that early peaceful verse, quote, "This, Surah 109:6, was revealed before he was commanded to wage war against the idolaters," unquote. This is abrogation. Such violent verses which abrogate earlier peaceful ones include, but are not limited to, Surah 9:5 and 9:29.
Let's go to Surah 9, Ayah 29. There's a good one. Surah 9, Ayah 29 says very clear, to make war on the people of the book, the Al-Kitab. I'm a Al-Kitab, as a Christian. They're to make war on me. Now to ask me if that's supposed to be very peaceful.
Offensive jihad is something that developed over time in Islam and represents the last teachings of Muhammad on jihad. Since there are no prophets after Muhammad, according to Orthodox Islam, no one can overturn Muhammad's final teaching on the matter. And Muhammad's final teachings, again, are offensive. They're found in Surah 9. There are other sources, but Surah 9 being the last of the chapters that Muhammad claimed were revealed to him that were included in the Quran. Those final chapters clearly teach offensive warfare, and that's the program then that Muslims are to follow until the end of time.
When we study jihad, the most important thing to keep in mind is that jihad proceeds in stages, and there are three main stages that we could break down. Stage one applies when Muslims are completely outnumbered. They can't hope to win a physical confrontation with unbelievers. Muslims are taught to proclaim a message of peace and tolerance, and chapter 109 of the Quran is a good passage to study in light of this. It commands Muslims that if someone disagrees with them, you say, "To you be your religion and to me be my religion." Very peaceful. But that's only under those circumstances. When Muslims can fight, when they can fight unbelievers but aren't in a position to subjugate those unbelievers, here we have stage two. And in this case, Muslims are to engage in defensive jihad. They're allowed to fight, and they have to fight if they're being attacked or persecuted, or if people are making fun of Islam, something like that. Muslims are to fight, but the unbeliever has to do something. It has to be some sort of provocation. But that isn't the end of the story. There's also stage three, when Muslims are in the majority. They're commanded to fight offensive jihad. And the most important verse for Christians here would be chapter 9, verse 29 of the Quran. It says, "Fight those who do not believe in Allah," and it specifically refers to Jews and Christians. It commands Muslims to violently subjugate us until we pay the jizya, until we pay tribute money to Muslims. So this offensive jihad stage is what is commonly denied by Muslims in the West, but it was certainly present. It's present in the Quran, it was present in the life of Muhammad, and it's been present in Islam for 14 centuries. And we're seeing the ramifications.
Surah 9:5 concerns pagans, quote, "And when the sacred months have passed, then kill the polytheists wherever you find them, and capture them and besiege them, and sit and wait for them at every place of ambush. But if they should repent, establish prayer, and give zakah, let them go on their way. Indeed, Allah is forgiving and merciful," unquote. The context of this verse is the Meccan pagans had already been subjugated and beaten by Muhammad's armies at this time. But Muhammad was not happy with them remaining pagan, so he produced this verse nullifying every treaty or agreement with them, ordering them to become Muslim or be killed. This is confirmed by some of the greatest and most respected Muslim scholars of history. For example, Ibn Kathir stated, quote, "This honorable ayah, 9:5, was called the ayah of the sword, about which Al-Dahaq bin Muzahim said, it abrogated every agreement of peace between the Prophet and any idolater, every treaty and every term," unquote. Muslim scholar Ibn Juzay also said, quote, "Kill the mushrikeen wherever you find them, abrogating every peace treaty in the Quran," unquote. And Islamic scholar As-Suyuti affirmed, quote, "This Quran 9:5 is an ayat of the sword which abrogates pardon, truce, and overlooking," unquote. In Sahih Bukhari, Muhammad interpreted this verse by saying, quote, "The statement of Allah, but if they repent by rejecting shirk, polytheism, and accepting Islamic monotheism," narrated Ibn Umar, Allah's messenger said, "I have been ordered by Allah to fight against the people until they testify that none has the right to be worshipped but Allah, and that Muhammad is Allah's messenger, and offer the prayers perfectly and give the obligatory charity. So if they perform that, then they save their lives and property from me." Now concerning Surah 9:29, which again says, "Fight those who do not believe in Allah or in the last day, and who do not consider unlawful what Allah and His messenger have made unlawful, and who do not adopt the religion of truth from those who were given the scriptures, fight until they give the jizya willingly while they are subdued," unquote. Muslim scholar Ibn Kathir explains how this is jihad, and what exactly it means, quote, "Allah ordered them to wage jihad against the people of the scriptures, unless they believed or agreed to pay the jizya," unquote. Now, an earlier verse Muslim apologists in the West cite in order to deceive people to think Islam is peaceful is Surah 2:256, which says, "There is no compulsion in religion." However, again, the later verse, Surah 9:5, abrogates this since it says to kill the pagans unless they convert, repent, establish prayer, and give zakah. As Ibn Kathir noted, quote, this verse, 2:256, is abrogated by the verse of fighting. Western Muslim apologists also cite Quran 68, quote, Allah does not forbid you from those who do not fight you because of religion, and do not expel you from your own homes, from being righteous toward them, and acting justly toward them. Indeed, Allah loves those who act justly, unquote. However, Tafsir al-Jalalain explains this verse, quote, was revealed before the command to struggle against them, unquote. Now, Muhammad clearly taught offensive jihad in the following Sahih Muslim hadith, quote, it has been narrated by Umar b al-Khattab that he heard the Messenger of Allah say, I will expel the Jews and the Christians from the Arabian Peninsula, and will not leave any but Muslim, unquote. In the same book, Muhammad also said, quote, I have been commanded to fight against people, so long as they do not declare that there is no God but Allah, and he who professed it was guaranteed the protection of his property and life on my behalf. Muslim scholar Ahmed Hassan explains this means, quote, Muslims are allowed to fight with unbelievers until they utter the credo of Islam, unquote. In Sahih Muslim we also read, quote, it has been reported from Sulaiman b Buraid through his father that the Messenger of Allah would say, fight in the name of Allah and in the way of Allah, fight against those who disbelieve in Allah, make holy war, unquote. Now, it's important to consult the Muslim scholars of history and today who seriously studied the Quran and Ahadith their whole lives to see what conclusions they came to on this issue of jihad. The 8th century Islamic law scholar Abu Yusuf, who lived quite close to the time of Muhammad, said, quote, one fights Arabs only to oblige them to embrace Islam without making them pay the poll tax. The decision in respect to non-Arabs is different because they are fought not only to convert them, but also to oblige them to pay the poll tax, unquote. Moreover, commenting on Surah 2:256, Islamic scholar Ibn Kathir stated, quote, therefore all the people of the world should be called to Islam. If any one of them refuses to do so, or refuses to pay the jizya, they should be fought till they are killed, unquote.
يصطفيكم الله لنفسه ولدينه لتكونوا قاطرة الأمة لمرحلة الاستخلاف والأمن والتمكين بل والفتوحات الدعوية والعسكرية التي ستفتح عواصم العالم بأسره وعما قريب إن شاء الله ستفتح روما كما فتحت القسطنطينية ببشارة نبينا محمد نقطة متقدمة للفتوحات الإسلامية التي تنساح في أوروبا كلها ثم تلتفت إلى الأمريكتين بل إلى أوروبا الشرقية.
The 12th century Islamic sheikh Burhanuddin Ali remarked, quote, the destruction of the sword is incurred by infidels, although they be not the first aggressors, unquote. This is offensive jihad. Influential Islamic scholar and commentator of the Quran, Abul Maududi, who died in 1979, said, quote, the ultimate objective of Islam is to abolish the lordship of man over man and bring him under the rule of Allah. This purpose is called jihad. Undertake jihad and establish Allah's rule on earth. Let us come forward and fight in Allah's cause with whatever we possess, unquote. The 14th century Islamic historian Ibn Khaldun said, quote, in the Muslim community, the holy war is a religious duty because of the universalism of the Muslim mission and the obligation to convert everybody to Islam, either by persuasion or by force, unquote.
هناك ادعوهم إلى 3 خصال فإذا لقيت عدوك من المشركين فادعوهم إسلام جزية فاستعن بالله وقاتلهم بدون ما يقاتلوك قاتلهم فاستعن بالله وقاتلهم عندما يقاتلونك لا عندما يرفضون دخول الإسلام ويرفضون دخول تطبيق دفع الجزية.
Lastly, Robert Spencer notes the 4 major schools of Islamic law teach offensive jihad, quote, all 4 principal Sunni schools of jurisprudence, the Shafi, Maliki, Hanafi, and Hanbali schools, agree on the importance of jihad warfare against non-Muslims who refuse to convert to Islam. Ibn Abi Zayd al-Qayrawana, a Maliki jurist, declared that it is preferable not to begin hostilities with the enemy before having invited the latter to embrace the religion of Allah, except where the enemy attacks first. They have the alternative of either converting to Islam or paying the poll tax jizya, short of which war will be declared against them. Ibn Taymiyyah, a Hanbali jurist who is a favorite of bin Laden and other modern-day jihadists, explained that the aim of jihad was that the religion and God's word is uppermost. Therefore, according to all Muslims, those who stand in the way of this aim must be fought. The other schools echo these teachings. The Hanafi school stipulates, if the infidels upon receiving the call to convert to Islam neither consent to it nor agree to pay the capitation tax, it is then incumbent on the Muslims to call upon God for assistance and to make war upon them. The Prophet moreover commands us to do so. Likewise, the Shafi scholar Abdul Hassan al-Mawardi taught that once infidels refuse the invitation to convert to Islam, war is waged against them, and they are treated as those whom the call has reached, unquote.
جهاد ابتدائي معناه غزو العالم من أجل نشر كلمة إذا تهيأت الظروف الموضوعية والذاتية وتهيأ الجند والسلاح والمال بل حتى لو تهيأ البيولوجي والكيماوي والكرتومي نحتل العالم من أجل أن تنتصر كلمة لا إله إلا الله محمد رسول الله على قبة موسكو وواشنطن وباريس.
In regards to terrorism, in a 2014 online speech translated by Memory TV, the Sudanese cleric Muhammad Ali al-Jazuli said,
إن دافع الضريبة الأمريكي له نصيب في دم كل طفل عراقي. ونبينا يقول، نبينا عليه الصلاة والسلام يقول من أعان على قتل امرئ مسلم بشطر كلمة فقد برئت منه الذمة. من أعان على قتل طفل مسلم بشطر امرئ مسلم بشطر كلمة بنصف كلمة. ولذلك نحن في الإسلام، واسمعوا مني هذه فتوى شرعية، الإسلام في حربه مع الكفار لا يعرف الفرق بين الجيوش النظامية والمواطنين المدنيين.
The hadith al-Jazuli paraphrased can be found in Sunan ibn Majah, quote, "It was narrated from Abu Huraira that the Messenger of Allah said, whoever helps to kill a believer, even with half a word, he will meet Allah with the words written between his eyes. He has no hope of the mercy of Allah," unquote. This gives Muslims justification for blaming civilian taxpayers for the death of Muslims, since soldiers their taxes fund fight and kill Muslim soldiers. Thus, Muslim scholars say Western civilians can be murdered in jihad because of this. This is why we see Muslims murdering soldiers and civilians in the street in the West. Islamic theologian Abu al-Ghazali said, "One may use a catapult against them non-Muslims when they are in a fortress, even if among them are women and children. One may set fire to them and or drown them," unquote. This is based on two ahadith in Sahih Muslim where Muhammad permitted the murder of unbelieving women and children, quote, "It is reported on the authority of Sa'b bi Jathama that the Prophet of Allah, when asked about the women and children of the polytheists being killed during the night raid, said, 'They are from them,' unquote." The 14th century Islamic scholar Ibn Taymiyyah said unbelieving women and children can be murdered by Muslims if they merely, quote, "fight with words, e.g. propaganda," unquote. Moreover, the reason Muslims engage in terrorist attacks against those who draw cartoons of Muhammad or who speak against Islam and Muhammad is because Muhammad allowed his followers to murder anyone who insulted him. For example, Muhammad allowed a blind man to stab his slave mother to death for merely criticizing Muhammad, and he allowed a man to strangle a Jewish woman to death merely for disparaging Muhammad. Moreover, Muhammad said the people who will receive the severest punishment from Allah will be the picture makers, unquote. So it's because Muhammad taught terrorism, which is why, according to the Clarion Project poll study, more than 42 million Muslims support the terrorist organization ISIS. These Muslims realize the ISIS caliphate and its brutal ways were actually sanctioned and practiced by Muhammad and his early caliph successors. Also, just concerning suicide bombings alone, 3,400 people were murdered in Islamic attacks in 2014, with 529 bombings. This is again because Islam teaches terrorism. Moreover, one could mention the Charlie Hebdo cartoonist massacre, which left 12 dead, the Ottawa Parliament attack, which left a Canadian soldier dead, the Muslim convert who did a lethal hit-and-run on a Canadian soldier in Quebec, the Muslim in France who drove his car through a crowd screaming Allahu Akbar, the Muslim who murdered 3 people at the Brussels Jewish Museum, the 2 black Muslims in Britain who ran over and then beheaded an innocent soldier named Lee Rigby in broad daylight with a machete, the Muslim in Oklahoma who beheaded his female co-worker after being fired for trying to convert people to Islam, the Nigerian Muslim terror group Boko Haram murdering close to 2,000 people in an attack on the city of Baga and surrounding villages in Borno State, the 4 Jewish hostages killed by Muslims in a parish kosher grocery store, the 10-year-old suicide bomb-strapped girl who murdered 19 in Maiduguri, northeastern Nigeria, the 10 murdered and 45 churches torched during protests over a Muhammad cartoon in Niger, the Libya hotel attack where Muslims massacred 9 people, the Detroit man who stabbed 2 people at a bus stop after asking them whether or not they were Muslim, the Kenyan Al-Shabaab Islamic militants who killed 148 people at a university, the Taliban massacres of 145 boys at a school, and the Muslim who murdered 4 Marines after storming military facilities in Chattanooga, etc. These are just some of the Muslim terror attacks inspired by Muhammad's teachings, which occurred during the production of this documentary.
I also want to speak tonight directly to Muslims throughout the world. We respect your faith. His teachings are good and peaceful.
Islam teaches peace.
Now, if it can be shown that Muhammad and his early successors, the caliphs, i.e. the heads of the Islamic State, engaged in offensive jihad warfare, that would prove jihad is part of Islamic teaching, and also that the Quran they were following teaches jihad. Muhammad said, quote, "Keep to my sunnah and to the sunnah of the rightly guided caliphs, cling to them stubbornly," unquote. The sunnah of Muhammad and the early caliphs Muhammad said must be followed are their teachings and actions. Hence, if they engaged in offensive jihad, then offensive jihad is a valid Islamic practice. The historian Will Durant notes, quote, "During his 10 years in Medina, he, Muhammad, planned 65 campaigns and raids, and personally led 27. In AD 625, Muhammad ordered an offensive invasion against the Jewish Banu Nadir tribe. After the slaughter, Muhammad then expelled the remaining survivors from Arabia. As an excuse to attack them, Muhammad claimed he received a revelation from Gabriel that they supposedly wanted to assassinate him. However, the context shows why he really attacked them. Historian William Montgomery Watt notes, quote, "The main underlying reason for the expulsion of the clan of al-Nadir was Jewish criticisms endangered the ordinary Muslim's belief in Muhammad's prophethood and in the Quran as revelation from God. It should also be kept in mind that the attack was made only a few weeks after the Muslim loss of life at al-Raji and Bir Ma'una, when many people in Medina must have been entertaining gloomy feelings. It is also possible that the allegation that the Banu Nadir tribe wanted to assassinate Muhammad was no more than an excuse to justify the attacks," unquote. Now in AD 627, Muhammad sent his adopted son Zayd bin Haritha to lead an offensive, unprovoked jihad raid at Al-Jamum, where the Muslims captured a group of non-Muslims and stole a bunch of their camels and goats. Again in AD 627, Muhammad sent Abdur Rahman bin Auf to lead an offensive expedition of 700 Muslim men against the Christian Banu Kalb tribe. The reason was to get them to submit to Islam, pay the poll tax, or die. Before sending Abdur Rahman bin Auf out on this attack, Muhammad said to him, quote, "Fight everyone in the way of God and kill those who disbelieve in God," unquote. Al-Waqidi confirms, quote, "At first they refused all but the sword," unquote. Now in AD 630, Muhammad sent al-Dahaq ibn Sufyan to lead a Muslim force to al-Zuji to command the people of the Banu Kilab tribe to embrace Islam or die. Al-Waqidi reported, quote, "The messenger of God sent an army to al-Qarata. They met them in Zuji. They invited them to Islam, but they refused. So they fought them and defeated them," unquote. Ibn Sa'd confirms the same thing, quote, "They invited them to embrace Islam. They refused, so they attacked them," unquote. In AD 631, over a dozen men of the Banu Azad clan led by Surad bin Abdullah became new converts to Islam. Muhammad's response was to order them to attack their non-Muslim neighboring tribes, that is, the people of Jurash in Yemen. Ibn Sa'd notes, quote, "He, Surad, invited them, the neighboring tribes, to embrace Islam, but they declined," unquote. The historian Al-Tabari notes the Muslim Surad therefore, quote, "inflicted a heavy loss on them," unquote. In AD 632, Muhammad sent Jarir ibn Abdullah al-Bajali on an offensive expedition to destroy the Dul Khalasa, which was a religious temple of the Yemenite pagans. Muhammad's soldiers slaughtered those trying to defend their temple. In Sahih Bukhari we read, "The Prophet said to me, 'Won't you relieve me from Dul Khalasa?' So I set out with 150 riders, and we dismantled it and killed whoever was present there. Then I came to the Prophet and informed him, and he invoked good upon us and Al-Amas tribe," unquote. In Hisham al-Kalbi's The Book of Idols, we also read of this campaign's offensive nature, quote, "The apostle addressed him, Jarir ibn Abdullah, saying, 'O Jarir, wilt thou not rid me of Dul Khalasa?' Jarir replied, 'Yeah.' So the apostle dispatched him to destroy it. He set out until he got to the Banu Abmas of the Bajali tribe, and with them he proceeded to Dul Khalasa. There he was met by Katham and the Bahila, who resisted him and attempted to defend Dul Khalasa. He therefore fought them and killed 100 men of the Bahila, its custodians, and many of the Katham, while of the Banu Kubafa, Ibn Amir ibn Katham, he killed 200. Having defeated them and forced them into flight, he demolished the building which stood over the Dul Khalasa and set it on fire," unquote. We will now turn our attention to some of the offensive jihad campaigns undertaken by Muhammad's early caliph successors, that is, the rightly guided caliphs. In AD 628, Muhammad sent his first caliph successor, Abu Bakr, to lead an offensive expedition against people of the Arab Banu Kilab tribe. Muslims began hostilities with this tribe by murdering some of their innocent men. In Sunan Abu Dawud, we read about a later Muslim attack after those innocent men were murdered, quote, "The Apostle of Allah appointed Abu Bakr our commander, and we fought with some of the people who were polytheists, and we attacked them at night, killing them. Our war cry that night was, 'Put to death, put to death.' Salama said, 'I killed that night with my hand polytheists belonging to 7 houses,' unquote." Now, after becoming caliph in AD 632, after the death of Muhammad, Abu Bakr engaged in various offensive campaigns. According to the book Biographies of the Rightly Guided Caliphs, which is a compendium from the works of Muslim historians like Ibn Kathir, al-Tabari, as-Suyuti, and others, the mindset behind Abu Bakr's conquests was the following, quote, "The basic aim of Muslim conquests was to spread the call to Islam to all nations in all lands, calling on people to embrace Islam or to enter a peace agreement and lead life under the protection of the Muslims. If they rejected both options, war would be the only choice left," unquote. This brings us to the conquest of Iraq ordered by Abu Bakr, specifically the Battle of the Chains. Abu Bakr ordered Khalid ibn al-Walid to march to Iraq in the region of Uballa with a Muslim force. The governor of this district of Iraq was Hormuz. Khalid sent Hormuz a letter saying, quote, "Surrender to Islam and you will live in peace. In the alternative, you may agree to the payment of jizya, and you and your people will be under our protection. Otherwise, you will have only yourself to blame for the consequences. I have brought you a people who desire death as ardently as you desire life," unquote. This is offensive jihad. This battle led to thousands of non-Muslims being killed. Moreover, Abu Bakr had Khalid engage in offensive jihad against the people of Al-Anbar, which was a town where caravans from Asham and Persia came. In regards to the Muslim motivation for waging this battle, the book Biographies of the Rightly Guided Caliphs explains, quote, "Khalid grew impatient. He wanted to spread Islam everywhere. So he looked westwards along the banks of the Euphrates and saw Al-Anbar," unquote. Although the governor of that district, Shirzad, tried his best to defend the town, the battle was ultimately lost. Regarding the second caliph Umar, who reigned from AD 634 to 644, it is necessary to mention his harshness towards Christians of Asham after they were put under Muslim rule. Ibn Kathir provides us with the terms of his treaty with these Christians. Under these terms, the Christians could not erect churches, monasteries, or sanctuaries for monks. They could not restore any place of worship that needed restoration. They could not publicly practice shirk, i.e. teach Jesus and the Holy Spirit are divine, or invite anyone to such beliefs. If a Muslim wanted to sit where a Christian was sitting, the Christian had to move and let the Muslim sit there. They could not erect crosses on the outside of their churches, and they could not bury their dead next to Muslim dead. Moreover, al-Bukhari tells us the following story of Ibn Umar. Quote, "Abdul Rahman said, Ibn Umar passed by a Christian who greeted him, and Ibn Umar returned the greeting. He was told the man was a Christian. When he learned that, he went back to him and said, 'Give me back my greeting,' unquote. This is because, as al-Bukhari reports, quote, Abu Hurairah reported that the Prophet said, 'Do not give the people of the book the greeting first. Force them to the narrowest part of the road,' unquote. Thus, it is quite clear Muhammad and his caliph successors practiced offensive jihad and subjugation, which means it is part of Islam. In sum, the historian Robert Hoyland observes, quote, "In just over 100 years, from the death of Muhammad in 632 to the beginning of the Abbasid Caliphate in 750, the followers of the Prophet swept across the whole of the Middle East, North Africa, and Spain. Their armies threatened states as far as the Franks in Western Europe and the Tang Empire in China," unquote.
Muhammad himself taught that unbelievers should be offered conversion or subjugation or war. Those are the only
That
choices.
is false. That is absolutely false.
Unfortunately, it's
Mutual
true.
understanding and inclusion. No, and you
It's
have to
true.
look at
Read the Quran.
you have to look at the I am reading the Quran. Robert.
Chapter
I don't
9,
know
verse
what you're
29.
reading.
Chapter
And your
9,
only
verse
solution to
29.
this.
Now, modern Muslims claim the Christian scriptures are corrupted because Muhammad contradicted Christian teachings, and because later Muslim writers attacked the preservation of the Bible.
I would say that the New Testament in particular, and the Bible in general, contains some messages from the previous prophets, including Jesus. But these messages are mixed up with the commentaries and writings of other persons and redactors and editors that came later on in such a manner that today we cannot simply just take anything at face value that Moses wrote this or Jesus said this.
However, despite this, the Quran itself actually teaches the Christian scriptures of Muhammad's time, which are the same ones we have today, were to be followed and were not corrupted. In Quran 4:136 we read, quote, "O ye who believe in Allah and his messenger and the scripture which he hath revealed unto his messenger, and the scripture which he revealed aforetime. Whoso disbelieveth in Allah and his angels and his scriptures and his messengers in the last day, he verily hath wandered far astray," unquote. Commanding people to believe in Christian scriptures presupposes they were intact and uncorrupted. Moreover, in Quran 568, the Muslims are told the 7th century Jews and Christians ought to listen to Allah and, quote, "perform the Torah and the Gospel, Injil, and what was sent down to you from your Lord," unquote. How could they do so if it was corrupted? Such texts could be multiplied. In fact, the earliest Muslim biographer of Muhammad's life, Ibn Ishaq of the 8th century, helps us know what Muhammad meant by his references to the Gospel or Injil of the Christians. Quote, Among the things which have reached me about what Jesus the Son of Mary stated in the Gospel, which he received from God for the followers of the Gospel, in applying a term to describe the Apostle of God is the following. It is extracted from what John the Apostle sent down for them when he wrote the Gospel for them from the testament of Jesus Son of Mary, unquote. The Gospel of John of Muhammad's time is the exact same one we possess today. Also again, in Ibn Ishaq's Life of Muhammad, we are told Muhammad affirmed the Torah of the 7th century is the truth from God, quote. Rafi b. Haritha and others came to him, Muhammad, and said, "Do you not allege that you follow the religion of Abraham and believe in the Torah which we have and testify that it is the truth from God?" He replied, "Certainly," unquote. Still more, in Sunan Abu Dawud, we are told Muhammad believed the Torah he possessed in the 7th century, quote. He then withdrew the cushion from beneath him and placed the Torah on it, saying, "I believe in thee and in him who revealed thee," unquote. Hence, although modern Muslims claim the Bible is corrupt and Muhammad contradicted its teachings, the fact is Muhammad still nevertheless affirmed the authority, inspiration, and pristine form of the Jewish and Christian scriptures. Now, Muslims claim Christians do not know who wrote the Gospels and that the authors of them were not eyewitnesses.
This is what you assume that Matthew wrote. This is what you assume Mark wrote. This is what you assume Luke wrote. This is what you assume that John wrote. Therefore, according.
However, history refutes this. Indeed, 2 Gospels, i.e. Matthew and John, were written by eyewitnesses, and Mark and Luke were written by people who had access to eyewitnesses and eyewitness testimony. Although a similar case can be made for Mark and Luke, we will discuss Matthew and John. That Matthew, the eyewitness and apostle, wrote the Gospel of Matthew is affirmed by the 1st century extra-biblical writer Papias, who knew apostles of Jesus and eyewitnesses of the apostles. Matthean authorship is also affirmed by Irenaeus, writing around AD 180, Pantaenus, who died in AD 200, and Origen, 185 to 254. That this tradition about Matthean authorship is uniform in the early church, with no early rival authorship theories existing, is evidence Matthean authorship is true. This can be proved internally as well. For example, in numerous Matthean passages, financial transactions are discussed, and none of this content contradicts what a 1st century tax collector like Matthew would know about finance. Also, we see in chapter 22:19, the Gospel of Matthew alone not only uses the word denarion, but also the more precise Greek term, nomisma, or state coin. In contrast, when discussing the same event, the other synoptic Gospels only use denarion, not showing the same concern for the precise financial term Matthew does. This is what we would expect of a tax collector author, such as Matthew. Also, in Luke 5:29, we are told that Matthew made a great feast in his house, where Jesus then reclined and ate. Likewise, Mark 2:15 says his house. However, in Matthew's account, Matthew 9:10, we read that Jesus and the disciples reclined at the house. This is consistent with one writing of their own house in a 3rd-person narrative. Regarding John, son of Zebedee, the disciple of Jesus, being the author of the Gospel of John, this is affirmed by the 2nd century writer Irenaeus, sourcing his contemporary acquaintance Polycarp, a pupil of the apostles such as John. Justin Martyr, AD 103 to 165, references John 3:3-5, while in the same work speaking of the Gospels, including John, in terms of memoirs of the apostles in the plural, most likely referencing John and Matthew, since he indicates Mark and Luke were written by those who knew the apostles. Moreover, the author of this Gospel affirms he was an eyewitness of Jesus. In fact, in John 21:20-24, the author of this Gospel affirms he was an eyewitness known as the beloved disciple. That this beloved disciple was the Apostle John is easily proven. Earlier comments in chapter 21 narrow down the list of possible beloved disciple candidates to Peter, Thomas, Nathanael, James son of Zebedee, John son of Zebedee, and 2 unnamed disciples, by placing them at this post-resurrection appearance where the beloved disciple was present. Of these 7, scholars have easily ruled out Peter, Thomas, Nathanael, and James as being the beloved disciple, and supporting the orthodox belief that it was John son of Zebedee and not one of these 2 unnamed disciples is the fact that in the 4th Gospel, the beloved disciple and the Apostle Peter are linked closely together. Interestingly, the non-Johannine New Testament data very strongly links John son of Zebedee and Peter as well. Thus, the beloved disciple is John. Moreover, in light of John the Baptist being identified simply as John, this presupposes the author of the 4th Gospel's audience would identify the Apostle John with another name, i.e. the beloved disciple, who was an eyewitness and the writer of this Gospel. We can further know that the beloved disciple is John, based on the special relationship 3 apostles had with Jesus. Out of the 12 apostles, 3 of them had a very unique relationship with Jesus, and it's fitting one of them should therefore be called the beloved disciple. These 3 are Peter, James, and John. We know Peter and James are not the beloved disciple who wrote this Gospel, since Peter is distinguished from the beloved disciple in various texts in John, and James died around AD 44, which is too early to compose the 4th Gospel. That leaves the Apostle John to be the one named as the beloved disciple. Now, Muslims claim the gospel biographies about Jesus were written too late to be reliable.
The Gospels that we have of Jesus were compiled within 40 to 60 years after the crucifixion. So that means in the late decades of the first century. And you say 40 years for the first and earliest of the four Gospels, that means that for 40 years the Christian community did not have these written documents. So how did they think about Jesus? How did they recollect his words? How did they preach about him?
However, their Quran was written 600 years after Jesus, and yet Muslims claim it offers reliable historical information about him. Moreover, in regards to the details of the life of Muhammad, their earliest extant writing is Ibn Ishaq's biography, Life of Muhammad, written around AD 750, which is 118 years after Muhammad's death. So Muslims are inconsistent. The fact is, the dating of the Gospels is not at all a problem. They were written between 40 and 65 years after Jesus lived. This is the same amount of time between the end of the Vietnam War in 1975 and now. Yet, there are many reliable eyewitness accounts of the Vietnam War from survivors written today. Compared to other ancient writings we have about prominent figures, the Gospels were written far closer to Jesus' life than they were. For example, our earliest biographies of Julius Caesar are Plutarch and Suetonius, who wrote around 140 to 160 years after Julius Caesar's death. Now, another reason the dates of the Gospels are not a problem is because the culture of Jesus' early followers was a skilled, memorizing culture that specialized in preserving oral tradition. This is why we can know the oral Jesus tradition that made its way into the written Gospels is trustworthy. There is much evidence of ancient Mediterranean memory skill in the environment of Jesus' followers. Ancient education was very focused on memorization, unlike today. The 1st century Roman elder Seneca noted he was able to recall over 100 recitations he learned from his youth, as well as list 2,000 names he memorized as a child in perfect sequence. Also, in another ancient source, we're told an elderly sophist was able to name 50 names in perfect sequence after only hearing them once. Moreover, the 1st century rhetorician Quintilian noted orators memorized whole speeches, which were oftentimes several hours long. What is more, communal memory, which is what Jesus' disciples engaged in, was even more reliable because the individual disciples who all heard the same teaching would help remind each other of different points. We know this took place in the ancient Mediterranean. In regards to young Jews, they would practice memorizing the Torah at home and in school. In regards to the Jewish disciples of rabbis, which is what the apostles were to Jesus, they were expected to memorize the rabbi's teaching and sayings through intense repetition exercises.
We do not have on record that anyone went about in the early decades of the 1st century memorizing the actual words of Jesus.
However, the evidence we just amassed proves that is exactly how Jesus' environment was. And ancient disciples often also engaged in note-taking while their teacher or rabbi was speaking. The ancient Jews of Jesus' time did this. Scholars note Matthew, as a tax collector, would have done this since he would know how to read and write. In fact, the 1st century writer Papias confirms this since he noted, quote, Matthew collected the oracles in the Hebrew language, unquote. In fact, at a conference, the classicist scholar George Kennedy showed a group of New Testament scholars his research on how ancient disciples would write notes when listening to their teacher. One form-critical scholar who was present, Reginald Fuller, said that these findings warrant an entire revision of the skeptical attitude on the New Testament passing of oral tradition. Now, the Gospel writers used earlier written sources too, which further helps to bring the dating of the content of the Gospels earlier. Scholars note Matthew and Luke used what is known as the earlier Q source. Luke used the earlier L material and other written eyewitness sources, and Matthew used his own source, known as M. Likewise, Mark used a pre-Markan source. So for Muslims to only mention how the Gospels were written down 40 to 65 years after Jesus, without mentioning these earlier sources they used, is dishonest. What is more, the fact the genre of the Gospels is Greco-Roman historical biography, and that this ancient genre is seen to be quite reliable by scholars, is evidence for the reliability of the Gospels, despite their date of composition. The consensus of scholars now is the Gospels are Greco-Roman historical biography, due to the works of Charles Thalbert and Richard Burridge. Burridge's book, which demonstrates this, is called What Are the Gospels? One example proving this is the Gospels have the same amount of words ancient biographies had, i.e. between 10,000 and 25,000 words. Other genres had a different amount of words. Another example proving this is ancient biographies often started with or focused on the person's adult career, which is what we have with the Gospels. This is significant because the intended genre of the Gospels was not novel, mythography, drama, fiction, or tragedy, etc., as some sometimes allege. but instead serious Greco-Roman historical biography. This is also significant because ancient histories and biographies generally showed great care for accuracy. Luke Acts is a multi-volume history, the first volume being biography, and Mark, Matthew, and John are Greco-Roman historical biography. Proof ancient historians and biographers were concerned with accuracy will now be shown. Ancient historians affirmed histories were to be truthful. The 2nd century Lucian of Samosata wrote that good historians did not falsify events, showing there was an expectation not to do so at that time in history. In fact, he said, quote, "If you are going to write history, you must sacrifice to truth alone," unquote. Ancient rhetorical historians affirmed they should not only be skilled rhetoricians, but also good researchers. Likewise, in the 1st century BC, Cicero said, quote, "Everybody knows that the first law of history is not daring to say anything false, that the second is daring to say everything true," unquote. Pliny the Younger was contemporaneous with the Gospels, and noted histories should be based on genuine facts. The Greek historian of the 2nd century BC, Polybius, noted historians ought to be acquainted with the places they write about, that they should do thorough investigation of what they write about, that they should not get facts wrong, and that they should not fabricate sources. Ancient historians thought it best to report recent events based on eyewitness oral tradition or to be an eyewitness themselves. Material can be multiplied. Now, Muslims claim the disciples were illiterate and thus could not do note-taking to help preserve oral tradition, or write the Greek New Testament Gospels attributed to them.
Even if you read the Greek in 1 Peter, it's very highly advanced for an unlettered Galilean fisherman to be writing in such sophisticated Greek and using the Greek Old Testament rather than the Hebrew.
They often quote agnostic critic Bart Ehrman on this, who claims, quote, "Something like 90% of the general population was completely illiterate, that is, unable to read and write at all. In the end, it seems unlikely that the uneducated lower-class illiterate disciples of Jesus played the decisive role in the literary compositions that have come down through history under their names," unquote. However, such a view has been challenged by recent scholarship. As Craig Keener notes, quote, "Certainly the supposition that few Palestinian Jews could write has been challenged and shown inaccurate," unquote. One evidence we will cite is there were Jewish synagogues in 1st century Palestine according to Josephus, Philo, Luke Acts, the Theodosius inscription, and the discovered remains of pre-70 AD synagogues at Galma, Herodium, Masada, and Qumran. And these synagogues functioned as education centers for young Jews so they could learn to read Torah and write. This refutes the idea 1st century Palestinian Jews were illiterate. We already argued since Matthew was a tax collector, he would have been able to read and write. Moreover, Luke, as a doctor and historian, would have known how to read and write. Regarding Mark, we know from early and late 2nd century historical evidence that he wrote down Peter's testimony for his gospel, which of course requires the ability to read and write. In regards to other early disciples of Jesus, Eddy and Boyd note, quote, "Luke notes quite incidentally that many before him had attempted to write accounts of what went on among the early Christians. On top of this, there are sayings in Paul's letters that parallel sayings in the gospel traditions. This may suggest that sayings were written down and circulated well before the gospels were written. Even more forceful, however, are the strong verbal similarities between Matthew and Luke when recording material not found in Mark. These similarities can be accounted for most easily by supposing that Matthew and Luke shared a common written source. In light of all this, it does not appear that the disciples were altogether illiterate," unquote. Finally, Muslims and others often misunderstand Acts 4:13 to teach the disciples Peter and John were illiterate. However, the text doesn't mean that. As the exegete Craig Blomberg points out, quote, "It is a myth that most 1st century Jewish men were illiterate, an idea sometimes based on a mistranslation of Acts 4:13, which implies only that the first disciples, Peter and John, were not formally apprenticed to a rabbi after reaching the age of 13, unquote. Now, Muslims often claim the disciples did not know Greek to be able to write the Greek Gospels. However, in light of the disciples being from rural Palestine, Keener relays, although Aramaic was probably the first language of most Galileans outside the urban centers, even in Lower Galilee, Greek was widespread in Palestine. Even the Semiticist Gustav Dahlmann long ago recognized the use of Greek in Jerusalem," unquote. To prove this, Keener cites the following studies. Secondly, New Testament scholar and Greek expert Stanley E. Porter argues, quote, "Among Jesus' disciples, not only Andrew and Philip had Greek names, but the names of Simon, Bartholomew, and Thaddeus may well have derived from Greek or gone easily into Greek. This scenario of Greek speaking is consonant also with the fact that several of Jesus' disciples were fishermen, for example Peter, Andrew, and the sons of Zebedee, James and John, which would have required that they conduct much of their business of selling fish in Greek," unquote. For his source showing fishermen needed to know Greek, Porter cites the following study. Thirdly, even if not all the early disciples knew Greek, there is good evidence, contrary to the claims of some, that in the first century, scribes were paid to write for people. Thus, such disciples would have paid a scribe to compose their gospel, or epistle in Greek. To quote Millard on some of the evidence, quote, "Nevertheless, scribes continued to do most of the writing, and that was still the case in the first century. By the New Testament times, most scribes still earned their living through clerical tasks, in administrative offices or on the street. The letters and legal deeds from the Bar Kokhba caves, which are often signed by the scribe, illustrate their work. Outside official circles, commerce, legal matters, and family affairs all called for secretarial skills, providing a livelihood for the multitude of scribes in Palestine. There are references to private letters in various sources from 1st Maccabees onwards, the Babylonian Talmud recalling how Rabbi Gamaliel II, about AD 100, dictated them to an amanuensis. See also Paul's use of Tertius in Romans 16:22. Actual examples of papyri survive in Palestine from the early 2nd century, and there are short notes in Hebrew and Greek from Masanda. The Bar Kokhba caves have also yielded legal deeds in Greek and Aramaic. In one case, the scribe was a husband of the woman involved in the deed and signed on her behalf, she, it is said, borrowing the writing. For the Greek documents, their editor stated, "The quality of writing in these subscriptions differ. One man's hand may be described as that of a practiced, experienced writer. While the majority of these deeds date from the beginning of the 2nd century, they continue a type current earlier. The deed dated in Nero's 2nd year bears the name of the scribe, with the preserved names of 2 witnesses, and a fragmentary Aramaic deed in a late Herodian hand has the name of 5 in the 1st century." Unquote. Now, Muslims claim there are irreconcilable contradictions in the New Testament documents, which allegedly prove the Bible to be false. However, rarely do Muslims study the bulk of scholarly Christian works which address the so-called contradictions unbelievers bring up. For example, Gleason Archer's Encyclopedia of Bible Difficulties, Geisler and Howe's Big Book of Bible Difficulties, Haley's Alleged Discrepancies of the Bible, Arndt, Horber's, and Rohr's Bible Difficulties and Seeming Contradictions, etc. In-depth conservative exegetical commentary sets also do a good job of addressing alleged contradictions. Now, one of the lists of alleged contradictions Muslims like to parrot comes from Bart Ehrman. He often offers the following.
What day did Jesus die on? And what time of day? Did he die on the day before the Passover meal was eaten, as John explicitly says, or did he die after it was eaten, as Mark explicitly says? Did he die at noon, as in John, or at 9 a.m., as in Mark?
He lists more, but here we will address 2. Did Jesus die the day before the Passover meal was eaten, as John explicitly says, or did he die after it was eaten, as Mark explicitly says? Well, John does not explicitly say Jesus died the day before Passover meal was eaten. He says Jesus died on the, quote, day of preparation of the Passover, John 19:14, which refers not to the day of preparation for the Passover meal, which was on Thursday. The phrase is Paraskiu Tau Pasha, and it instead refers to the day of preparation of Passover week, which was indeed on Friday. D.A. Carson proves this with the following ancient references. So when Mark says Jesus died the day after Passover meal, which was Friday, there is no contradiction because John is saying he died on the day of preparation of Passover week, which was also Friday. Both agree. Now, did Jesus die at noon, as in John, or at 9 a.m., as in Mark? Well, Mark does not say Jesus died at 9 a.m. Mark 15:25 says Jesus was crucified at 9 a.m. Big difference. However, Mark goes on to say in Mark 15:34-37 that at the 9th hour, or 3 p.m., Jesus, quote, uttered a loud cry and breathed his last, unquote. So Jesus died at 3 p.m. according to Mark. John 19:14 says Jesus was carried away to be crucified at about the 6th hour. This is going by Roman time since John wrote in Ephesus, the Roman province of Asia. This means Jesus was carried away to be crucified at about 6 a.m. according to John, and was actually crucified at 9 a.m. according to Mark. And again, he died later that day at 3 p.m. according to Mark 15:34-37. Hence, there is no contradiction. Now, a popular alleged contradiction Muslims bring up has to do with how long Jesus was dead before rising. After quoting Matthew 12:39-40, which says Jesus would be dead for 3 days and 3 nights, Muslim apologist Ahmed Didat wrote, quote, Jesus was supposed to have been crucified on a Friday afternoon, so Friday night he is supposed to have been in the grave. Next morning, Saturday day, he is supposed to be in the grave. Saturday night also, he is supposed to be in the grave. But Sunday morning, the first day of the week, when Mary Magdalene visits the sepulchre, she finds it empty. The answer we were after was 3 days and 3 nights, but unfortunately we are getting 1 day and 2 nights, unquote. However, Didat did not understand the Hebrew method of reckoning days Jesus was using, which is why he came up with those figures. As D.A. Carson observes, quote, in rabbinical thought, a day and night make an onah, and part of an onah is as a whole. Thus, according to Jewish tradition, 3 days and 3 nights need mean no more than 3 days, or the combination of any part of 3 separate days, unquote. Thus, Gleason Archer concludes, quote, according to ancient parlance then, when you wish to refer to 3 separate 24-hour days, you said 3 days and 3 nights, even though only a portion of the first and third days might be involved, unquote. Now, Muslims wonder why the Gospels tell the same story a bit differently at times. Well, this was common in ancient biography and did not render the work erroneous. For example, the 1st century writer Plutarch penned many biographies, yet among his various biographies the same story is often told a bit differently on purpose, because he was using common compositional devices. The Gospels used these as well, and they were not regarded as erroneous. These devices included spotlighting, where one main figure is focused on in an account, whereas in another account, more figures might actually be present. Another device is called compression, where events are portrayed as happening in a shorter period of time than they actually occurred. Another is called transferal, which is when words or deeds of a person or group are transferred to the dominant person in the story. Another is called displacement, which is when the author removes an event from its context and places it to another. And lastly, there is simplification, which is where although in one biography an event may be very detailed, in another it may not be, because detailing it is not essential to that work's objective, which is the subject's character, etc. Michael Licona has demonstrated these are not contradictions. They are simply ancient compositional devices, and they account for many of the so-called New Testament errors Muslims and other unbelievers bring up. Plus, the Quran tells the same stories in different places with different words and details.
In fact, for 200 years, they've been trying to assail the Bible. They've been trying to use historical criticism, redacted criticism, source criticism, literary criticism, every kind of doctrine, the documentary hypothesis, all these different criticisms have been foisted against the Bible since the late 1800s. Every one of them have been answered. I love this book. You've got the right man at the right place doing the right thing in the right time. And that's why this book is such a great foundational book for us today.
Now, Muslims like to make a big deal out of the fact that there are around 400,000 textual variants in the thousands of ancient New Testament manuscripts we have. However, because of their lack of understanding of the field of textual criticism, they severely overstate the significance of this. It must be noted there are a lot of variants because there are a lot of manuscripts. Scholars affirm about 99% of these variants are not viable or meaningful, meaning they don't change the meaning of the text or reflect the original reading. The vast majority of these variants are minor spelling differences or nonsense errors that have no impact on the meaning of the text and which are easily spotted to not be the original reading. The second most common variants are ones that do not affect translation or which involve synonyms. For example, some manuscripts will mention names like Mary or Jesus, while others use the definite article with the name saying the Mary or the Jesus. These all count as variants, but of course don't affect translation. Moreover, sometimes manuscripts will have words in different order, even though scholars know what is being conveyed, whatever word order is used in the manuscript. The third most common variants are ones that affect the meaning of the text but are not viable or reflective of the original reading. And lastly, there are those variants which both affect the meaning of the text and are viable or a possible reading of the original. But these only make up about 1% of the variants. So noting there are around 400,000 variants in the thousands of New Testament manuscripts without mentioning this is dishonest. As Timothy Paul Jones notes in his refutation of one of Bart Ehrman's books, quote, most of these 400,000 variants stem from differences in spelling, word order, or the relationships between nouns and definite articles, variants that are easily recognizable. In the end, more than 99% of the 400,000 differences fall into this category of virtually unnoticeable variants. Of the remaining 1% or so of variants, only a few have any significance for interpreting the biblical text. Most important, none of the differences affect any central element of the Christian faith, unquote. Now, in their book Jesus, Prophet of Islam, Muslim authors Muhammad Atta-ur-Rahim and Ahmed Thompson falsely claim it was the Council of Nicaea of AD 325 which selected which books would be included in the New Testament, and that there were allegedly hundreds if not thousands of Gospels they chose from. However, this is historical fiction. Their book provides no sources for these claims. The Council of Nicaea dealt with combating Arianism, not the canon of the New Testament. As even the non-Christian critic Bart Ehrman states, quote, the Council of Nicaea did not deal with the matter of canon, unquote. Now, if one looks at the historical evidence regarding which books were accepted among the early Christians prior to the formation of the canon, there were not hundreds or thousands of books which were being considered as legitimate. The Muratorian canon of AD 170, Origen's canon of the mid-3rd century, and Eusebius's canon of the early 4th century accepted basically all the New Testament books Christians today accept, and the books they list as unreliable or forgeries to not be regarded as canon are few in number, not hundreds or thousands. Moreover, they were mostly a few dubious Gnostic forgeries of the 2nd century, not serious 1st century Orthodox books. Church historian and theologian Gregor Allison explains how the canon of the early Christians from the 2nd to the 4th century prior to canonization actually looked, thus refuting this dubious Muslim claim, quote, "It should be noted that nearly all the New Testament writings that we consider canonical were viewed similarly by the early church. The 4 Gospels, the Acts of the Apostles, 13 letters of Paul, 1 Peter, 1 John, and at least in many circles the Revelation of John. Several writings that are now considered canonical, James, 2 Peter, 2 and 3 John, Jude, Hebrews, were on the fringe of the early church's canon. Still other writings were on the margins of the early church's canon, but ultimately were not included in the New Testament. The letter of Barnabas, the Shepherd of Hermes, the Didache, and several other works appeared with some consistency in some of the lists of canonical writings. The church eventually recognized that none of these passed the tests of apostolicity and antiquity, and thus they could not be part of the canonical scriptures composing the New Testament," unquote. This is the true picture of the canon of the early church, not this Muslim lie that there were hundreds or thousands of books being seriously considered as canon. This is the consensus of scholarship. The aforementioned letter of Barnabas, written between AD 100 and 130, is important to discuss now. This document various Christians in the early church liked is not the same as the later Gospel of Barnabas, which modern Muslims like and exploit, even though Muslim writers often confuse the two documents. Because many early Christians liked the theologically sound Epistle of Barnabas, and because there is a later separate forgery called the Gospel of Barnabas, which is sympathetic to aspects of Islamic theology, Muslim writers often confuse the two writings and claim the early Epistle of Barnabas is the one that teaches Islamic themes, even though it doesn't. Both texts are easily accessible online, and anyone can read them to see they are different. The early Epistle of Barnabas does not deny Jesus' crucifixion or deity, as the later Gospel of Barnabas does. For example, the Epistle of Barnabas says, quote, "If therefore the Son of God, who is Lord of all things, and who will judge the living and the dead, suffered, that his stroke might give us life, let us believe that the Son of God could not have suffered except for our sakes," unquote. And, quote, "If the Lord endured to suffer for our soul, he being Lord of all the world, to whom God said at the foundation of the world, let us make man after our image, and after our likeness, understand how it was that he endured to suffer at the hand of men," unquote. So the early Epistle of Barnabas affirms God the Father spoke to Jesus in Genesis 1:26, saying, "Let us make man in our image," thus affirming Jesus' deity, and it also affirms Jesus' sonship and sacrifice for sins. Now, although the later separate Gospel of Barnabas does deny Jesus' crucifixion and deity, that doesn't matter because this document is a medieval forgery, not written by the historical Barnabas. As the scholar of Islam Cyril Glass notes in his book, The New Encyclopedia of Islam, quote, "As regards the Gospel of Barnabas itself, there is no question it is a medieval forgery. A complete Italian manuscript exists, which appears to be a translation from a Spanish original, which exists in part, written to curry favor with Muslims of the time. It contains anachronisms which can date only from the Middle Ages and not before, and shows a garbled comprehension of Islamic doctrines, calling the Prophet Muhammad the Messiah, which Islam does not claim for him. Stylistically, it is a mediocre parody of the Gospels, as the writings of Baha'u'llah are of the Quran," unquote. Michael Licona lists some of these anachronisms contained in this document, quote, "The year of Jubilee is said to occur every 100 years, chapter 38. However, the year of Jubilee was celebrated every 50 years until the papal decree in AD 1343, placing the date of writing sometime afterward. Medieval feudalism is mentioned in chapter 122, and medieval court procedures in chapter 121. Someone in the 1st century would not have known about these things. Wooden wine casks are mentioned in chapter 152, instead of wineskins which were used in 1st century Palestine," unquote. Thus, the modern Muslim appeal to this document as early proof for Islamic theology is totally erroneous and ridiculous. Now, certain Muslims claim various verses deny Jesus was crucified. Others who believe Jesus was crucified claim Jesus survived crucifixion, did not die, and was raised up to Allah after being injured instead. Muslims sometimes claim while Jesus was in the tomb, the spices the women brought for him were actually medicines which supposedly healed the injured but alive Christ. This is ridiculous since in the Old Testament dead kings were anointed with aromatic spices to honor them. This is what is going on here. The women were displaying Jesus' kingly dignity and removing any disgrace of his crucifixion. It was not to revive him. New Testament scholar James R. Edwards confirms, quote, "The Jews anointed corpses with oil mixed with myrrh and aloes. The purpose of anointing was to perfume the decaying corpse as an act of devotion," unquote. Moving on, Muslims also claim Jesus is presented as dying too quickly in order for Jesus to have actually died. For example, Ahmed Didat quoted Mark 15:44, where Pontius Pilate marvels that Jesus died so soon. Didat also noted how in John 19:32-33, the soldiers do not break Jesus' legs to finish him off, but only those of the criminals next to him. However, to answer these arguments, John 19:33 says Jesus' legs were not broken because the soldiers, quote, "saw that he was already dead," unquote. Moreover, after Pilate marveled Jesus died so soon, Mark 15:44-45 says he summoned a centurion and asked him if Jesus was dead, and the centurion confirmed he was. This is significant because centurions were professional executioners, and it was their job to kill and know if someone was dead. Moreover, the testimony of the narratives are explicit Jesus died from crucifixion here, and there were eyewitnesses who were present who confirmed it, such as Jesus' women followers. Also, there are many reasons to affirm Jesus died by crucifixion because of the brutality of the method of crucifixion itself, despite the short amount of time Jesus was on the cross. Victims of crucifixion were tortured ruthlessly by flogging. Josephus notes people would be whipped until their intestines were exposed. Seneca explains crucifixion victims had, quote, battered and infective carcasses, and were maimed, misshapen, deformed, nailed, and drawing the breath of life amid long drawn-out agony, unquote. After flogging, the victim was nailed to a cross or tree. There is only one report of a man ever surviving crucifixion in the ancient Roman world, and it's because he was removed from his cross quickly and given Rome's best medical care. According to this report, Josephus pleaded with Titus the commander to remove 3 of his crucified friends from the cross. Of the 3 who were quickly removed after crucifixion and provided with Rome's best medical care, 2 died and only 1 survived. So even if Jesus was removed from the cross while alive, his chances of survival were slim, especially since he was not provided with any medical attention, much less Rome's best, and was put in a dark tomb with no air or water. After reviewing the material concerning Jesus' crucifixion, medical experts wrote in the Journal of the American Medical Association, quote, interpretations based on the assumption that Jesus did not die on the cross appear to be at odds with modern medical knowledge, unquote. A strong positive case can be made for Jesus' crucifixion. In Quran 4:157, Muhammad denied the historical event. However, the most powerful rebuttal to Muhammad's denial of this is to note there are 4 indisputable sayings of Jesus, which meet the criteria of authenticity, where Jesus predicts his own crucifixion. We will discuss one of these. In Mark 8:31, Jesus says he, the Son of Man, must be rejected, killed, and then rise from the dead. Now, in the immediate context, Jesus rebukes one of his leading apostles, Peter, and calls him Satan for defying what was to take place. This is an embarrassing feature about Peter later Christians would not invent. Thus, we know this text is authentic because it meets the criterion of embarrassment. Moreover, Jesus' use of the title Son of Man in this text is dissimilar to how later Christians identified Jesus, which shows they didn't invent Jesus' statements here. Thus, the text also meets the criterion of dissimilarity. Also, there are Semitisms or Semitic elements in the text and in the parallel texts in Matthew 16:21-23 and Luke 9:22, showing Jesus' statement truly does originate in a Palestinian Jewish environment. Lastly, the saying meets the criterion of multiple attestation, since the sayings in Matthew 16:21-23 and Luke 9:22 are independent. Thus, there's no question the historical Jesus predicted his own crucifixion, which utterly refutes Muhammad. Another proof is the Gospels mention Jesus' weakened state in a request for the cup to pass him. This is not how fictitious Jewish accounts of martyrs were at the time of Christ. Instead, such martyrs were presented as extremely brave and strong as they endured their torture and execution. The fact the Gospels do not follow this pattern, but instead admit embarrassing features about Christ's true humanness during his crucifixion, helps show these accounts are genuine. They meet the principle of embarrassment and plausibility historians look for.
Surah 4:157 of the Quran, where we're told that the Jews boasted that they killed Jesus, the Messiah, the son of Mary, the messenger of Allah. But then Allah says they neither crucified nor killed him, but so it was made to appear to them. On the basis of this verse, Muslims have historically denied that Jesus was crucified, and yet this is the best attested fact about Jesus from not only the standpoint of Christians, but even the most radical skeptics.
Now, early extra-biblical Christian testimony of the historicity of the crucifixion includes 1 Clement, written around AD 101, Ignatius of Antioch, AD 110, and Polycarp of Smyrna, written between AD 110 and 135. These writers knew Jesus' original disciples and learned this truth from them. Moreover, early non-Christian extra-biblical sources confirming the historicity of Jesus' crucifixion include the Stoic philosopher Mara bar Serapion, writing sometime after AD 73, the first-century Jewish historian Josephus, the Roman historian Tacitus, who wrote around AD 117, the second-century Greek satirist Lucian of Samosata, and the Babylonian Talmud. Liberal skeptical scholar Paula Fredrickson says Jesus' crucifixion is one of the, quote, undisputed facts about Jesus. Atheist New Testament historian Gert Ludemann wrote, quote, Jesus' death as a consequence of crucifixion is indisputable, unquote. Non-Christian Jewish scholar Giza Vermis affirmed, quote, the passion of Jesus of Nazareth is part of history, unquote. Another non-Christian Jewish scholar, Pinchas Lapid, said Jesus' death by crucifixion is, quote, historically certain, unquote. Agnostic scholar Bart Ehrman stated, quote, One of the most certain facts of history is that Jesus was crucified on orders of the Roman prefect of Judea, Pontius Pilate, unquote. Liberal New Testament critic John Dominic Crossan said there is not the, quote, slightest doubt about the fact of Jesus' crucifixion under Pontius Pilate, unquote. Plus, the Messiah's death for sins is predicted in the Old Testament in Isaiah 53, 5-11. Now, a final comment on the verse of the Quran which denies Jesus' death, Quran 4:157, is necessary. The verse says, "And because of their saying, we slew the Messiah, Jesus son of Mary, Allah's messenger, they slew him not nor crucified him, but it appeared so unto them, and lo, those who disagree concerning it are in doubt thereof, and they have no knowledge thereof, save pursuit of a conjecture. They slew him not for certain," unquote. Now, there's no inspired ahadith commentary on this verse, and Muslims can't even agree on what it means. Some claim it means Jesus was crucified but survived and did not die. These would include people like Ahmad Didat, Shabir Ali, Osama Abdullah, and others. Other Muslims claim the text teaches Jesus was not even on the cross at all. What does it mean, "it appeared so unto them," that Jesus was killed and crucified? We're not told. The common Muslim idea someone was substituted to go on the cross is not attested in the early Islamic literature. As the commentator Muhammad Asad notes, quote, "There exists among Muslims many fanciful legends telling us that at the last moment God substituted for Jesus a person closely resembling him. According to some accounts, that person was Judas, who was subsequently crucified in his place. However, none of these legends find the slightest support in the Quran or in authentic traditions," unquote. Thus, many Muslims disagree "it appeared so unto them" even means someone was put on the cross in Jesus' place. Muslims like Daryabadi and Usmani will claim Jesus was taken up bodily to heaven during his life before he could be crucified, based on Quran 4:158, the next verse. Yet, Muhammad Asad observes, God exalted him to himself here does not refer to God taking Jesus up bodily during his life. Rather, it simply refers to God honoring Jesus. Why do these Muslim disagreements and issues exist if the Quran is clear, and if its verses are fully detailed elsewhere in the Quran, something the Quran claims of itself? In light of all this Muslim confusion, contrary to Quran 4:157's claim, it's not the Christians who are in doubt and pursuing mere conjecture regarding Jesus' crucifixion. It's actually the Muslims who are in doubt and pursuing mere conjecture when they try to figure out what Quran 4:157 even means.
Moreover, even if we go along with Muslims and pretend that Jesus wasn't crucified contrary to all historical evidence, the verse is still in error because it puts in the mouth of the Jews that they killed the Messiah, the messenger of Allah. And yet, the very reason that the Jews would have had for killing Jesus is not that he was the Messiah. No Jew would have made that boast. They, in fact, would have killed him for claiming to be the Messiah if they had rejected that claim. So when the Quran says that their stated reason for, or what they state about him is that he was the Messiah and they killed him, that just doesn't square with historical reality.
In their book Jesus, Prophet of Islam, Muhammad Atta-ur-Rahim and Ahmed Thompson claim because of Paul, quote, Jesus was deified, unquote. However, the teaching of Jesus being God or God being multi-personal is affirmed in the Old Testament, in pre-Christian Jewish literature, and by Jesus and his disciples prior to Paul. In regards to the Old Testament, in Proverbs 33-4, we read about a father and son who are called the Holy Ones, persons who are incomprehensible in their nature. The text says, I have not learned wisdom, nor have I knowledge of the Holy Ones, who has ascended to heaven and come down, who has gathered the wind in his fists, who has wrapped up the waters in a garment, who has established all the ends of the earth. What is his name? And what is his son's name? Surely you know, unquote. All the deeds listed in this passage are applied to Christ in the Bible. For example, Jesus ascended to heaven and comes down. Jesus gathered the winds in his fist and wrapped up the waters in a garment. And Jesus established the ends of the earth. So this son is Jesus Christ. Moreover, when the author asks what his and his son's name is, this is very important. God's name in the Old Testament signified his divine presence, essence, or nature. Hence, when this biblical writer asks what the names of these two persons are, and asks who has knowledge of them, he is affirming he, as well as humanity, is incapable of fully comprehending the presence, essence, or nature of these two holy ones, God and his Son. Old Testament scholar Alan P. Ross notes various Midrash writings prove ancient Jews understood this son of Proverbs 33-4 to be a divine figure alongside God, called the Logos, which is who Christ is identified as in the New Testament. Another Old Testament text is Isaiah 9:6, where mention is made of a son who would be given, which presupposes he existed before his birth, and who is called the Mighty God, or El Gabor in the Hebrew. This is the same Hebrew word applied to God himself in the very next chapter, namely Isaiah 10:21. so there's no question this son is divine, and the ancient Jewish Targum of Isaiah affirms this text is about the Messiah, as does Targum Jonathan and Midrash Rabbah Deuteronomy. Next we read in Daniel 7:13-14, quote, I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven there came one like a son of man, and he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him, and to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should worship him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed, unquote. Jesus applied this text to himself in the Gospels. In fact, James R. Edwards notes, quote, Daniel 7:13 and on is never understood in early Judaism as a collective expression of people of the Holy One, but always as the individual Messiah, unquote. That the Son of Man of Daniel 7 is deity is proved by his coming with the clouds of heaven, which is always what God does in the Old Testament. Also, the fact the Son of Man is worshipped by all people proves he is deity. The word for worship here, in the original Aramaic, is pelak. Old Testament scholar Stephen R. Miller notes that, quote, in every other instance where the verb pelak occurs in biblical Aramaic, it has reference to service, worship, rendered a deity, unquote. Jesus receives worship rendered deity. Another Old Testament text is Isaiah 48:16, where Yahweh is said to send Yahweh and his Spirit. This is the Trinity in the Old Testament. Two persons are identified as Yahweh, and you have the divine Holy Spirit. Moreover, in Isaiah 63:8-10, there are three distinct persons, the messenger or angel, the sender of the angel who is God, and the Spirit. In this text, God sends his messenger, and the messenger and his Holy Spirit then save God's people. The messenger is said to be the messenger of his face, which was a Hebrew idiom meaning this messenger is God's face, i.e. he is the expression of God's self-revealing presence. This brings us to the angel of the Lord in the Old Testament. On the one hand, we're told this angel is a distinct person from God, and yet he is described as God or divine. For example, Hagar identifies the angel as God himself after he appeared to her. In fact, here the angel claims he would multiply her descendants, which is what God himself says. The angel appears in a burning bush to Moses, and when he speaks, he is said to be God speaking. Then in Exodus 4:5, we're told it was actually God himself who appeared to Moses in the burning bush. Moreover, God's name is said to be in the angel of the Lord. The name of God, again, is God's divine nature. The angel appears to Gideon, and Gideon makes sacrifice to him. In fact, he fears he would die after seeing this divine being. Gideon thought this because the Jews believed if you saw God face to face, you would die. Thus, the angel is deity. The reason Gideon survived was because although the angel is God, he is not the same person as the Father. Lastly, the angel appeared to Manoah and his wife, and then Manoah offered a sacrifice to him. Now, what did the pre-Christian Jews and non-Christian Jews shortly after the time of Jesus think about such issues as the angel of the Lord and God being multi-personal? Well, modern Jewish scholars such as Daniel Boyarin and Alan F. Siegel have proven in their books that pre-Christian Jews and non-Christian Jews shortly after the time of the New Testament affirmed that the one God was comprised of multiple persons, just as Christianity teaches. This proves Paul or later Christians did not invent this idea as Muslims falsely claim. For example, Boyarin's conclusion of his research into this matter was that ancient Jews, quote, believed that God had a divine deputy or emissary or even son, exalted above all the angels, who functioned as an intermediary between God and the world in creation, revelation, and redemption, unquote. Likewise, Alan F. Siegel's findings are summarized as follows, quote, the ancient Israelite knew of two Yahwehs, one invisible, a spirit, the other visible, often in human form. The two Yahwehs at times appear together in the text, at times being distinguished, at other times not. Early Judaism understood this portrayal and its rationale. There was no sense of a violation of monotheism, since either figure was indeed Yahweh. There was no second distinct God running the affairs of the cosmos. During the Second Temple period, Jewish theologians and writers speculated on an identity for the second Yahweh. Guesses ranged from divinized humans, from the stories of the Hebrew Bible, to exalted angels. These speculations were not considered unorthodox. That acceptance changed when certain Jews, the early Christians, connected Jesus with this orthodox Jewish idea. This explains why these Jews, the first converts to following Jesus the Christ, could simultaneously worship the God of Israel and Jesus, and yet refuse to acknowledge any other God. Jesus was the incarnate second Yahweh. In response, as Siegel's work demonstrated, Judaism pronounced the two powers teaching a heresy sometime in the 2nd century AD. We will now provide some of the early evidence these Jewish scholars have put forth in their works to prove this. At the time of the Book of Daniel, an extra-biblical Alexandrian Jew named Ezekiel the Tragedian affirmed the presence of a second divine figure on God's throne. In the 1st century Jewish book, the Book of Enoch, The Messiah is described as pre-existing and being worshipped by humanity. Then in the same book of Enoch, the Messiah is expressly identified as God and not counted among them, i.e. humans. In the 1st century Jewish book, 4th Ezra, mention is made of a divine man who conquers evil armies at the end of the age and is then presented with offerings by the saints. 4th Ezra got this idea from Isaiah 66:20, which says offerings will be brought to God. Now, a 2nd century tradition, preserved in the Mechalita Midrash on the book of Exodus, combats an earlier Jewish view of God, which said he was multi-personal according to various Old Testament texts, i.e. that there were two Yahwehs making up the one God. 1st century Jewish historian Josephus combated the Jewish belief that God had assistants in creation, which shows such a belief existed in his day. The late 1st century Jewish book, Apocalypse of Abraham, presents a figure named Yahuel as the second power in heaven who has God's name in him. Having God's name in you, again, refers to God's divine presence or essence. Thus, Exodus 23:21 says the angel of the Lord has God's name in him, the same name of God, i.e. presence or essence, which resided in the very temple of God. In a portion of the 1st century Jewish text known as Prayer of Joseph, preserved for us by Origen, both the prophet Jacob and an angel named Uriel claim ascendancy as the pre-existent second Yahweh or divine angel of the Lord who appeared to men in the Old Testament. This is the religious milieu in which Jesus appeared. The earliest Christians rightly identified Jesus as this pre-existent second divine Yahweh of the Old Testament, who assisted the Father in creation and appeared to men on behalf of the Father. Jesus applied numerous Old Testament texts about God to himself, thus proving he is God. In Isaiah 43:2-3, God tells his people not to be afraid when they pass through the waters, for he is the Lord their God. Well, in Matthew 14:24-27, the disciples were afraid because the waters were beating against their boat. Then Jesus said, "Take heart, I am, do not be afraid." Moreover, in Malachi 3:1 and 4:5, a messenger, that is a voice crying in the wilderness, is said to precede Yahweh's coming to his people. In Matthew 11:10, however, Jesus applies this text to John the Baptist and himself, meaning John the Baptist makes the way for Jesus, who is Yahweh who comes to his people. Jesus' disciples likewise applied to him Old Testament texts about God. In Isaiah 8:12-13, Isaiah calls men to sanctify Yahweh in their heart. Peter, however, applies this to Jesus and exhorts men to sanctify Christ in their heart. In Zechariah 12:10, Yahweh is the pierced one upon whom men would look and mourn. However, the Apostle John applies this text to Jesus at his crucifixion. Peter says there is no name under heaven given among men by which we must be saved. This is because, as the background text proves, quote, "The name of the Lord is a strong tower. The righteous man runs into it and is safe," unquote.